Have you ever wondered what truly built the first civilization? Not farming, not kings, not even fire, but fear. A fear so ancient, so deep, that it changed the way humans gathered, obeyed, worshipped, and survived. Before cities rose from the earth, before temples touched the sky, there was one terror in the dark that pushed people to create order out of chaos. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because tonight we go back to the first fear that may have created human civilization itself. The storm arrives before language is ready for it, long before walls, before fields, before gods are given names that can be carved into stone. There is a human body standing under a sky that suddenly turns violent, and there is no explanation that can make the violence smaller. The air tightens. Light splits the horizon with impossible speed. A crack rolls across the open land so hard it seems to tear the world itself. Somewhere in that darkness, a child jerks awake. Somewhere else, a hunting party freezes in place. In the mouth of a cave, a woman pulls the young closer without knowing whether the rock above her is shelter or trap. The wind changes direction, trees bend, fire gutters low. For a few seconds, all the familiar shapes of the world disappear, and what remains is the oldest kingdom human beings ever knew: uncertainty. That world is not merely dangerous. It is saturated with danger so completely that safety is never a background condition, only a brief pause between threats. Night belongs to things with better eyes. Grass hides teeth. Rivers swell without warning. The injured bleed too easily. The sick weaken quickly. One broken bone, one infected cut, one wrong season. One sudden cold snap can erase an entire line of memory before it has time to become history. Modern people are used to fear as interruption. For prehistoric humans, fear is closer to climate. It hangs over the day from dawn until dark and stays after dark, changing shape but never fully leaving. The evidence remains incomplete, as it must for lives so distant and so lightly preserved. But what survives in the record suggests that early humans do not merely endure fear, they are formed inside it. A herd animal fears in flashes. It startles, runs, survives, settles. A human being acquires something more difficult. The danger passes, but the mind keeps hold of it. The branch that snapped yesterday may snap again. The valley where someone vanished still lies ahead on the migration path. The cave where the air smelled wrong and fever spread among the sleepers becomes more than a place. It becomes a remembered warning. This is one of the great transformations of the human story. Fear stops being only a bodily reflex and becomes a stored pattern, a model of the world carried forward in memory. The body recoils. The mind preserves the recoil. It learns to expect. It learns to imagine. And once imagination attaches itself to danger, the world grows larger and darker than what the eyes can actually see. That change may be one of the most powerful events in human prehistory, though it leaves no clean fossil behind. Bones can show injury. Teeth can show starvation. Campsites can show fire and tools and butchered animals, but the inward experience of dread has to be inferred from what human cognition becomes capable of doing. At some point, a mind not only hears thunder, but anticipates thunder. At some point, a mind not only sees a companion die, but begins to understand that death can come for anyone, at any time, for reasons that are not always visible. At some point, a species becomes able to live not just in the present danger of claws and weather, but in the future danger of possibilities. That is an astonishing ability, and a cruel one. It helps humans survive. It also burdens them with a constant awareness that survival is never secure. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The landscapes of deep prehistory sharpen that feeling rather than soften it. Picture a plain at the edge of the Ice Age, vast and beautiful in a way that offers no comfort. Wind moves through low grass under a sky so broad it feels almost hostile. Herds cross the distance, but so do predators. Temperatures fall quickly after sunset. The horizon gives little warning of what is coming. Or picture a broken woodland in a warmer interglacial period, thick with cover, rich in food, and therefore rich in ambush. Every environment gives life, but each gives it conditionally. Nothing comes without risk. Early humans move through these worlds with immense skill, and it would be wrong to imagine them as helpless creatures trembling at every sound. They are intelligent, adaptable, physically capable beings. They track, gather, cooperate, improvise. They know plants, roots, seasons, animal behavior, water sources, shelter, yet competence does not cancel fear. In harsh environments, competence deepens it, because skill reveals how many variables can still go wrong. The archaeological record offers small, quiet glimpses of this precariousness. Healed fractures in ancient skeletons show that some injured individuals survive long enough to recover, which implies care, patience, and social support. That is one of the more moving clues in human origins. Someone slows down for the wounded. Someone shares food with a person who cannot hunt. Someone keeps another person alive through pain and weakness. But the same evidence points in another direction as well. Injury is common because danger is common. Trauma on bones, stress markers in teeth, signs of malnutrition, hard seasonal swings, and the constant threat of infection all suggest a world in which death is ordinary, near, and often sudden. Scholars still debate exactly how frequent violence between groups may have been in the deepest past, and no single explanation fully accounts for regional differences. But there is little doubt that life often unfolds under the pressure of uncertainty so persistent that it must have shaped not only behavior, but emotion and memory. That is where the story becomes larger than survival in the narrow sense. A group that fears well survives better. Individuals who recognize patterns of threat, remember them, communicate them, and act on them have advantages. A rustle that means nothing may still be treated as warning. A certain cloud formation may signal retreat. A smell in the air may precede floodwater. A season that arrives late may mean hunger. Human vigilance is expensive. It costs sleep. It costs calm. It keeps the body ready for impact, but it also saves lives. Evolution does not ask whether a trait is pleasant. It asks whether it works often enough to persist. In that sense, fear is not a flaw in the human story. It is one of its oldest tools. Yet tools change the hand that uses them. Once fear becomes chronic, it begins to organize behavior beyond the immediate moment of threat. Camps are chosen differently. Sleeping arrangements matter. The old, the very young, the skilled, and the vulnerable are positioned with care. Fire is guarded. Noise is monitored. Watchfulness becomes a social act. Someone stays awake while others sleep. Someone listens for movement beyond the circle of light. Someone notices that certain places feel safer than others, though safety may be little more than reduced odds. The group begins to distribute fear. It is no longer trapped inside one nervous system. It becomes shared attention, shared habit, shared caution. This matters because civilization, in its most distant beginning, does not start with monuments or kings. It starts when human beings begin organizing themselves around things they must face together. And the things they face are not limited to predators and storms. One of the most unsettling forces in prehistoric life is simple absence of explanation. A healthy person falls ill and dies in days. A child does not wake. Animals vanish from a hunting range that has fed the group for years. Rain fails. Then rain does not stop. Fire appears in the distance and consumes a slope that looked eternal. A river shifts course. A winter lasts longer than memory expects. The ground itself may tremble. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, but the world they inherit is full of patterns that can only partly be read. This gap between event and understanding is fertile ground for a special kind of fear, one that does not end when the danger ends, because the cause remains obscure. The tiger leaves tracks, the storm leaves wreckage, but what leaves fever, what steals breath, what turns fortune without warning? When knowledge runs out, dread expands to fill the space. This may be the first true threshold in the story of civilization, not agriculture, not writing, not cities. Earlier than all of those lies the moment when fear becomes something more than reflex and begins to demand interpretation. A frightened animal seeks escape. A frightened human also seeks meaning. That need is easy to underestimate from the comfort of explanation-rich societies. But in the prehistoric dark, meaning is not a philosophical luxury. It is psychological shelter. If an event can be fitted into a pattern, then perhaps it can be anticipated. If it can be anticipated, perhaps it can be managed. If it can be managed, perhaps the group can live with a little less terror. Even a mistaken explanation may feel better than none. In that sense, the road toward myth, ritual, taboo, authority. An eventually organized sacred life may begin not with wonder, but with the refusal to remain defenseless before chaos. There is a lesser-known detail hidden in studies of human cognition that makes this even more striking. The human brain appears especially tuned not just to detect threats, but to over-detect agency in uncertain conditions. A movement in the grass is safer to interpret as something intentional than as wind, at least until proven otherwise. A sound in darkness is treated as presence, not accident. This bias, useful in survival terms, may have consequences far beyond hunting and hiding. Once minds are inclined to sense agency behind ambiguous events, the world starts to feel inhabited in ways that exceed direct evidence. The storm is no longer only weather. The illness is no longer only misfortune. That shift does not happen all at once, and it surely differs across times and places, but it opens a profound possibility. Fear begins to populate the unknown. Still, nothing about this process should be romanticized. The prehistoric world is not a mystical theatre waiting for spiritual awakening. It is a hard, physical world in which many human groups fail, disappear, move, thin out, recover, and adapt under pressures that are often brutal. Entire populations may bottleneck. Regional cultures may vanish without leaving much trace. Human relatives other than our own species endure for immense stretches of time and then fade. Climate lurches. Landscapes transform. Coasts drown. Grasslands spread and collapse. Forests advance and retreat. For a species trying to build continuity from one generation to the next, this instability is not background scenery. It is the defining fact. Fear arises because reality gives it reasons. And yet, within that fear, something creative is already stirring. A group huddled against wind and thunder is not only suffering the unknown, it is beginning, however dimly, to think together about it. Eyes turn toward the same darkness. Bodies orient to the same sound. Memory gathers around the same terrible moments. One person notices what another missed. One elder recalls a season like this from years before. One parent invents a cautionary pattern to protect the young. Out of those exchanges comes a fragile but decisive development shared mental worlds. The group does not merely react together, it starts building common maps of danger. The details are lost to us, but the structure remains visible in everything humans later become. That is why the first fear matters so much, not because humans are uniquely weak, but because they are uniquely unable to leave fear in the instant where it begins. They carry it forward, they compare it, they teach it, they shape behavior around it. They turn private dread into collective memory, and collective memory into systems of meaning. Civilization will one day be made of stone, grain, walls, law, hierarchy, ritual, writing, and power. But before any of that, there is a nervous system under a blackening sky, trying to understand why the world can become unrecognizable in a single flash. There is a campfire shrinking in the wind. There are hands pulling others close. There is a silence after thunder that feels almost worse than the sound itself. And in that silence, something deeply human begins to form the sense that survival depends not only on strength or skill, but on finding a way to live with fear that never fully goes away. Once fear settles into memory, the world becomes harder to leave alone. A sudden death is no longer just a death. A flood is no longer just water moving where water always wanted to go. A sky darkening at the wrong hour is no longer only a change in light. Early humans lived close enough to the land to know its rhythms intimately. But intimacy does not guarantee comprehension. In fact, it often sharpens the shock when familiar patterns fail. The herd that usually returns does not return. The season that should break the heat does not break it. The moon disappears into shadow, and for a little while the night seems to swallow even the one bright thing that had seemed dependable. What begins to grow in that space is not simple ignorance. It is an emotional logic, a sense that events this large, this strange, this disruptive must mean more than they first appear to mean. That impulse has deep roots in the way human perception works. The mind is not built to sit comfortably inside randomness. It looks for connection, intention, sequence, and hidden structure. Sometimes that instinct is magnificent. It allows tracking, planning, prediction, tool-making, and social cooperation. It lets humans anticipate where animals will move, when fruit will ripen, how weather might change, which route offers the fewest risks. But that same instinct does not turn itself off when the evidence becomes thin. It continues searching anyway. A world full of danger and partial information invites the mind to complete the pattern, whether the pattern is really there or not. This is where nature begins to feel purposeful. Consider thunder again, not as modern meteorology understands it, but as it lands in the body of someone with no theory of electricity, pressure fronts, or charge separation in clouds. The sky flashes, the ground answers. Sound follows light in a delay that feels eerie and deliberate. Trees split, fires start. Rain sometimes comes afterward, but not always. The event is both above and around, untouchable and overwhelming. It behaves like force, but also like announcement. It is difficult to imagine any human mind encountering that repeatedly, and not sensing some form of agency behind it. Scholars still debate how early symbolic thought becomes elaborate enough to personify such forces, but the evidence from later traditional societies around the world suggests a broad human tendency to treat sky violence as meaningful, not accidental. That does not prove a single prehistoric belief system. It does suggest a powerful recurring habit of mind. The same logic touches fire, though fire offers a more complicated relationship. Lightning may ignite a grassland or tree, leaving behind ruin and opportunity at once. Burned landscapes can attract animals to fresh growth later. Fire terrifies, but it also transforms. A human group that sees both destruction and usefulness in flame may begin to treat it as something more than a natural process. It behaves almost like a living thing. It feeds, it spreads, it dies, it returns, it can be carried, guarded and shared. It can also escape and punish carelessness. This ambiguous mixture of gift and threat matters. Some of the forces most likely to gather symbolic meaning are precisely the ones that nourish and endanger at the same time. They resemble power in its purest form, useful, unstable, and impossible to ignore. Eclipses may have been rarer but even more disturbing. The evidence remains incomplete because such moments leave no direct archaeological imprint. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for how communities respond emotionally to sudden celestial anomalies. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric people paid close attention to cycles in Skian season long before formal astronomy existed. If so, then a predictable sun or moon interrupted by temporary disappearance would not feel ordinary at all. It would feel like a breach. Even for later literate civilizations, eclipses remain potent signs, often feared as warnings, punishments, or cosmic disturbances. There is every reason to think earlier humans experienced something similar in emotional terms, even if their interpretations differ. The heavens do not merely provide light and navigation, they provide order. When the ordered thing breaks, fear intensifies because the frame around daily life seems to crack. Floods, droughts, and disease push this logic further because they strike directly at survival and often do so unevenly. One part of a landscape may be spared while another is ruined. One family may sicken while another remains well. In such circumstances, randomness rarely feels random. It feels selective. A camp that loses 2 people to fever while others survive cannot easily understand the mechanism. But it can feel the pattern as moral or intentional even without words for morality in any abstract sense. Something has happened to us. Something has passed over them. Something has chosen. The mind gravitates toward actors, even invisible ones, because events that discriminate seem easier to grasp when attached to will. This does not mean prehistoric humans immediately invent full pantheons or richly detailed supernatural beings. More likely, the process begins in rougher outlines, a sense that behind the scene world lies another layer of force. There is an important difference here between practical knowledge and existential interpretation. A group can know perfectly well that dark clouds often precede rain, and still feel that a particular storm means something more. People can observe animal tracks, seed cycles, wind direction, and water behavior with astonishing accuracy, while also believing that certain events express intention beyond material causes. The modern habit of opposing empirical awareness and spiritual imagination too sharply can obscure how the two coexist. In many traditional societies recorded much later, knowledge of ecology is sophisticated, detailed, and effective, yet it lives alongside ritual and sacred explanation. Early humans likely operate in a similarly entangled world. They are not choosing between science and myth as if standing at a modern crossroads. They are using every available mental tool to survive in an environment that often exceeds explanation. This is where the psychological architecture of civilization begins to deepen. Fear does not simply push humans toward shelter or weapons. It pushes them toward narratives that can stabilize experience. A narrative does not have to be elaborate to matter. It may be as simple as linking an event to a place, a taboo, a season, a remembered wrong, or a present sensed but not seen. Over time, repeated connections harden. The cave where echoes distort sound becomes a place of power. The tree struck twice becomes marked. The valley where sudden mist is followed by loss acquires cautionary force, a sequence of observations, some valid and some mistaken, begins to produce invisible geographies of danger and meaning. The landscape is no longer neutral terrain, it becomes charged. One lesser-known clue to this transformation may lie in the human tendency to respond emotionally to unusual but natural features such as caves with deep resonance, springs that appear warm in cold weather, stones with strange shapes, or places where animal bones accumulate in uncanny patterns. Such features would not need advanced theology to trigger a special status. They would simply need to feel different enough from the ordinary world to invite caution, curiosity, and repetition. Once a place acquires repeated emotional significance, behavior around it changes. People lower their voices, they leave objects, they return with intention, they tell others what happened there. In this way, awe and fear begin blending into the earliest sacred sensibility. There is still uncertainty about just how far back this goes. Scholars debate whether Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic humans attribute symbolic meaning to natural events in ways comparable to Homo sapiens, or whether the richer evidence belongs mainly to later populations with more developed symbolic culture. The archaeological record can show pigments, arranged objects, possible burials, unusual deposits, and repeated use of specific sites, but motives remain partly obscured. What can be said with more confidence is that by the time symbolic behavior becomes clearly visible, humans are already treating parts of the world as more than physically useful. Some places are not just practical, some events are not just events. The mind has crossed a threshold where the unseen matters. That threshold changes social life because shared interpretation is more powerful than private anxiety. If one person feels dread before a storm, that feeling remains personal. If the group begins to agree that storms carry intention, warning, or consequence, fear becomes organized. Behavior can now be coordinated around explanation, not just reaction. Certain actions may be avoided before weather shifts. Certain gestures may be performed after disaster. Certain people may be trusted because they notice signs others miss. The group begins to operate not only within a material environment, but within a shared universe of meanings. This is not yet religion in any formal or institutional sense, but it is already something larger than instinct. It is culture being built around invisible causes. The emotional force of this development should not be underestimated. To feel that nature is intentional is frightening, but it is also strangely consoling. A random world is unbearable because it cannot be negotiated with. A world filled with purpose, however severe, at least allows response. If thunder is only noise, humans must endure it helplessly. If thunder is a sign, a presence, or a warning, then perhaps human action still matters. Perhaps conduct, offerings, caution, memory, or obedience can alter outcomes. Even mistaken agency can be psychologically useful because it preserves the possibility of relationship. This may be one of the oldest bargains human beings ever make with fear, better an unseen power than blind chaos. From there, a subtle moral universe begins to emerge. A failed hunt may not merely be bad luck, it may reflect impurity, offense, neglect, or imbalance. Illness may not merely happen, it may arrive because some boundary was crossed. These ideas can sound primitive only from a distance. Up close, they are attempts to convert uncertainty into pattern, and pattern into action. If something happens for a reason, then one can search for the reason. If one can search for the reason, one can try to prevent recurrence. That logic lies behind countless later traditions, but its emotional foundation is prehistoric. Fear teaches the mind to ask not only what happened, but why it happened to us. And once that question takes hold, human attention turns increasingly toward invisible relationships. The world becomes thicker than what sight confirms. Wind may carry mood, silence may precede force, death may not end presence, a place may remember what occurred there. Ancestors may linger in some sensed but undefined way. None of this needs to be systematized immediately. At first, it is enough that the seen world no longer seems complete in itself. Behind weather, illness, fortune, and disaster there may be intention. Behind intention there may be entities, or laws, or offended powers, or ancestral continuities. The forms differ across cultures and centuries, but the fundamental move is ancient fear opens the door through which the invisible enters human life. This does not mean early humans are wrong about everything simply because their categories differ from modern ones. Some ritualized caution around places, animals, seasons, and bodily states may preserve real adaptive knowledge even when framed symbolically. A taboo can encode hygiene. A sacred prohibition can protect breeding grounds. A feared season can reflect actual environmental danger. Myth and practice often braid together. No single explanation fully accounts for how such systems originate, because they draw from ecology, memory, psychology, and social need all at once. Still, what matters here is that the first great leap has occurred. Nature is no longer mute. It appears to answer, punish, warn, conceal, and reveal. By the end of this shift, human fear is no longer aimed only at things with teeth or weather fronts on the horizon. It is aimed at meanings hidden inside events. The dark does not merely hide predators, it hides intention. Lightning does not simply strike, it declares. The flood does not only rise, it judges, or at least seems to. Whether the world truly possesses such purpose is beside the point for now. What matters is that the human mind begins living as though it might. In that decision, half-conscious and scattered across thousands of years, lies one of the earliest foundations of civilization. Because once people believe that reality carries messages, they will start gathering to interpret them together. A fear held alone is heavy, but a fear held together becomes structure. That change is easy to miss because it leaves behind no single invention, no one dramatic threshold where scattered people suddenly decide to become society. Instead, it emerges in habits so ordinary that they almost disappear from the record where bodies sleep, who keeps watch, how warnings are given, which memories are repeated, which dangers are taught to the young before they can understand them for themselves. Long before law, long before kings, long before priests speak for cities, there is a more ancient order forming under pressure. It begins when dread stops belonging only to the individual body and becomes something a group learns to manage collectively. In a small prehistoric band, almost everything depends on shared attention. One pair of ears is never enough. one person's memory of a predator path, one person's notice of changing wind, one person's suspicion about unsafe water can preserve many lives if the information spreads quickly enough. This is one reason fear becomes social so easily. It rewards communication. A startle response is useful in the moment, but warning is useful beyond the moment. The cry that sends others scrambling uphill before floodwater reaches camp is more valuable than silent panic. The remembered shape of a dangerous ravine matters more when told than when merely felt. What survives in the record suggests that human success is inseparable from this widening circle of vigilance. Groups that share fear effectively also share survival. That shared fear is not simply alarm. It gradually becomes a kind of emotional commons, a pool of remembered dangers available to everyone in the band. A child who has never seen a leopard attack may still grow up behaving as though the threat is known, because older people transmit caution before direct experience arrives. Someone too young to remember the harsh winter still learns where hunger pushed the group and which route failed them. Someone who has never watched a river burst its banks can still be taught which ground not to trust when clouds mass in a certain way. Here, fear becomes culture in one of its earliest forms. It is stored not in writing, but in repeated practice, story fragments, tone of voice, gesture, and taboo. Knowledge of threat is passed on because forgetting is expensive. This creates a powerful shift in what human groups are. They are no longer only clusters of individuals cooperating in the present. They are communities carrying forward an inheritance of anxiety shaped by earlier lives. Fear becomes historical before history exists. A place is avoided because something happened there once. A season is treated carefully because of a scarcity remembered by elders. Certain behaviors are discouraged because they are associated, rightly or wrongly, with bad outcomes. Scholars still debate exactly how complex such transmission becomes in the deepest prehistoric phases, especially among different human species and regional cultures. But no single explanation fully accounts for human adaptability unless shared memory plays a major role. A group that remembers danger across generations is stronger than one that must relearn every threat from scratch. This also changes the internal life of the group itself. When danger is constant, closeness becomes more than affection. It becomes defense. Bodies gather not only for warmth, but for reassurance. Sleep, one of the most vulnerable states any animal enters, becomes a communal risk managed by trust. Some sleep while others remain half alert. The rhythm of rest is organized around the possibility of interruption. Even in safer shelters, the dark remains active in the mind. Sounds matter. Silences matter. A child waking in panic is not just comforted. The group responds because panic itself may signal something real. Over time, these patterns produce a social psychology built around mutual monitoring. Everyone depends on everyone else to notice what one person might miss. There is a lesser-known dimension to this that likely matters enormously. Fear sharpens attention not only toward the environment, but toward one another. In dangerous settings, emotional signals become important data. A face turned suddenly toward the tree line. A body freezing mid-task, an abrupt hush in conversation. These may all carry survival value. Humans become exceptionally sensitive to the moods and reactions of those around them. This is one of the roots of collective emotion. Dread can spread before its object is even clear. So can calm if embodied by someone trusted. That emotional contagion is not a side effect of social life. It is part of the mechanism by which groups coordinate under uncertainty. Civilization will later build vast institutions to regulate shared emotion. but the basic capacity begins here, in bands small enough to fit within a circle of firelight. Once fear becomes shared in this way, memory changes shape too. Individual recollection matters, but now events acquire a collective form. The storm is remembered not only as what one person saw, but as what happened to all of us. The illness is remembered as the season when we lost 2 people. The flood is the night the camp moved uphill in darkness. Group identity begins accumulating around shared survival episodes. This is a subtle but profound development. Humans do not merely survive together. They become the kind of group that survived that thing. Common danger helps define who belongs. A band that endured famine, outlasted cold, escaped predators, or crossed hostile ground together carries those experiences as part of its internal fabric. Fear, in that sense, helps weave belonging. At the same time, fear also produces boundaries. To know who shares your dangers is often to know who does not. Other groups encountered across a landscape may be trade partners, marriage partners, rivals, or threats, and often some shifting mixture of all 4. But uncertainty about outsiders is amplified when survival depends on tightly managed trust. A stranger does not merely bring novelty, a stranger brings unpredictability. They may compete for food, carry unfamiliar disease, disrupt established patterns, or ignore taboos whose purpose is not fully understood even within the group. This does not mean prehistoric life is a perpetual war of all against all. The evidence remains incomplete, and patterns vary widely across place and time. Yet fear almost certainly contributes to the earliest divisions between safe insiders and uncertain outsiders, between those whose warnings count immediately and those whose intentions must be tested. That pressure may be one reason language, gesture, and symbolic communication become so socially valuable. The more precisely danger can be signaled, the more effectively a group can coordinate. A cry for aerial threat is different from a cry for ground threat. A gesture to stay silent is different from a gesture to run. A remembered sequence of signs about weather, terrain, or animal behavior increases collective resilience. Some scholars argue that social complexity and environmental challenge together drive the expansion of communicative sophistication, and fear likely plays its part in that process. The need to transmit urgent information quickly favors not just intelligence, but shared conventions. In this way, dread helps tighten the bonds through which culture itself moves. Yet shared fear does more than create practical warning systems. It also asks for explanation in communal form. Once a whole group has endured something terrible, the burden of making sense of it rarely stays private. The question becomes collective. Why did this happen here? Why then? Why to us? A lone individual may carry these thoughts silently, but a social species tends to speak them outward, however early or crude the form of that speech may be, around resting places, in moments after danger passes, in the long hours when bodies recover and attention loosens. People compare impressions. Someone noticed birds lifting before the storm. Someone remembers a smell in the air before the sickness. Someone thinks the river sounded different that morning. From such exchanges, patterns are proposed, tested, repeated, and sometimes sanctified. The important point is not whether those explanations are correct. Many surely are not, at least by modern standards. The important point is that the act of explaining together binds the group. Shared interpretation reduces isolation. Even uncertainty becomes easier to bear when distributed across many minds. This may be one reason human communities so often build emotional solidarity not only through celebration, but through shared response to fear. Mourning gathers people. Watching gathers people. Warning gathers people. Even later civilizations, for all their complexity, still reveal this ancient inheritance whenever catastrophe suddenly restores collective attention and collective ritual. The deep pattern is very old. Fear organizes. There is a dry but revealing truth hidden inside all this order may begin not from abundance, but from vulnerability. It is tempting to imagine civilization as the flowering of surplus, creativity, and ambition, and in many later stages that is certainly true. But at the beginning, before permanent structures or administrative power, there is something humbler and harsher. There are people who cannot survive if each one interprets danger entirely alone. They need alignment. They need dependable responses. They need certain memories to outlast the individuals who first learned them. This does not yet produce states or temples, but it does produce the preconditions of collective life trust, repetition, caution, and emotionally charged norms. One surprising implication follows from this. The first stable social orders may not arise primarily from optimism about cooperation, but from the management of dread. People gather because gathering lowers risk. They obey certain habits because disobedience feels dangerous. They repeat certain acts because repetition seems to keep chaos outside the boundary of the group. Children are taught not only skills, but fears worth inheriting. Elders hold authority partly because they remember what the world can do. Those who ignore warning place others at risk, which makes behavior a shared concern. Out of this, the first moral tones begin to emerge. Responsibility is no longer only personal. It becomes communal because fear itself has become communal. And once a group lives this way for enough generations, emotional habits harden into social architecture. Not architecture of stone yet, but of expectation. Who sleeps where? Who watches when? Who leads movement in crisis? Which voices are believed first? Which places are trusted? Which practices calm the group after loss? These are not trivial customs. They are early institutions in everything but name. They regulate vulnerability, they shape belonging, they preserve memory. Civilization will later build walls and write rules to accomplish similar ends on a much larger scale. But the logic begins here, in small bands facing an oversized world. So the birth of shared dread is also the birth of something almost paradoxical stability formed around danger. Human beings do not wait for fear to disappear before building social life. They build because fear does not disappear. They create routines not in peaceful conditions, but in order to survive unstable ones. They turn attention outward and inward at once, scanning the landscape while reading each other's faces, storing lessons in story, habit, and warning under pressure. The group becomes more than a number of bodies moving together. It becomes a vessel for remembered fear and coordinated response. That may be one of the first true engines of civilization, not the dream of greatness, but the need to face uncertainty as one mind spread across many people. Once fear has become shared, it needs a center. A scattered group can warn, remember, and react together. But something changes when the night is no longer endured only in darkness. A flame appears, then survives, then is carried, then guarded, and the entire emotional geometry of human life begins to shift. Fire is not the first human tool, but it may be the first tool that changes the meaning of being together after sunset. Before it, darkness is nearly absolute. A realm in which the human body loses its confidence and the senses begin handing power to whatever may be waiting beyond sight. After it, the dark still surrounds the group, but it no longer rules every inch of it. A boundary has been drawn. Inside the light there is warmth, visibility, and a fragile sense of control. Outside the light, the unknown remains, but now it can be faced from a center that feels almost like a world of its own. This matters for reasons far beyond comfort. Fire does not erase fear. In some ways it sharpens it, because the circle of light makes the darkness beyond seem even deeper. The flames reveal faces, tools, food, movement, and the rough edges of shelter. But they also stop short at a visible threshold, and at that threshold imagination gathers. The predator's eyes may flash there. The wind may carry sounds from beyond it. The trees may sway just outside clear sight. Human beings now live in two spaces at once, the illuminated zone of temporary order and the surrounding world of uncertain intent. That contrast is psychologically powerful. What survives in the record suggests that fire becomes not merely a technology, but a stage on which the earliest meanings of safety, danger, belonging, and exclusion are acted out night after night. The practical advantages are immense and well known. Fire warms bodies in cold climates, extends waking hours, deters some predators, hardens wooden tools, makes certain foods easier to digest, and may even alter human biology over immense time by changing diet and energy use. Scholars still debate the precise timing and consistency of fire control among early human populations, and the evidence varies by site and species, but no single explanation of human expansion into difficult environments can ignore it. Yet even these practical uses do not fully explain why fire becomes so central to human life. Many tools solve problems. Few reorganize social existence itself. Fire does that because it gathers people into fixed relation. It creates a place. A place, in deep prehistory, is never just a location. It is a concentration of repeated behavior and emotional expectation. The hearth is where food is prepared, where warmth is maintained, where injured people are tended, where the old can remain useful even when movement slows, where children absorb the rhythms of group life, and where the most vulnerable hours of darkness are turned into something bearable. Around fire, attention can hold steady in a way it cannot while moving across a landscape. People remain in one another's presence for longer stretches. Faces are readable, gestures are visible, memory has a chance to be spoken, demonstrated, repeated. This is one reason some anthropologists have treated the fireside as an engine of social and cognitive development. It lengthens the day, but more importantly, it thickens the night. In that thickened night, fear changes form. It no longer belongs only to the sudden encounter with danger, it becomes discussable. A hunt gone wrong can be replayed, a storm can be remembered in sequence. Someone can point toward the dark and mark where the sound came from, where the animal was seen, where the flood reached, where a companion vanished. The lesser-known force here is not just storytelling as entertainment, but storytelling as emotional regulation. A frightening event, once narrated and shared, becomes held within the group rather than trapped inside the startled body of one witness. The evidence remains incomplete, because words vanish more easily than bone, but what survives in the record suggests that human symbolic life deepens, where repeated gathering and shared attention become possible. Firelight is one of the great technologies of that possibility. This may also be where the darkness itself starts to acquire moral and symbolic weight. Day and night are physical realities for any creature, but for humans living by fire they begin to take on a richer psychological contrast. The day is movement, foraging, hunting, route finding, labour, exposure. The night is enclosure, watchfulness, memory, vulnerability, and interpretation. Light is not yet abstract goodness in any formal philosophical sense, and darkness is not yet fully developed evil. But the emotional distinction is already there in lived experience. One makes human control feel possible. The other constantly reminds the group of its limits. Over many generations, these repeated associations may help lay the groundwork for later systems in which illumination becomes linked with order, truth, or protection, while darkness becomes linked with threat, concealment, and the nearness of death. At the same time, fire itself resists easy categorization. It protects, but it also consumes. It nourishes, but it demands feeding. It can save a freezing group and kill a careless one. It can mark the center of camp, but if neglected, it escapes all boundaries. This ambiguity is important. Some of the earliest things humans are likely to treat with special caution are precisely those powers that cross the line between usefulness and danger. Fire behaves almost like a living agent without being alive in any ordinary sense. It grows, it spreads, it weakens, it dies if starved, it leaps when wind favors it. To control such a thing only partly is already to stand in a relationship that feels charged. No surprise, then, that in later societies across the world, hearths, sacred flames, and fire rituals become deeply symbolic. The roots of that symbolic force likely run much deeper than recorded religion. There is another effect of firelight that is easy to overlook. It makes the human face newly central. By day, attention often points outward toward terrain, prey, weather, movement. By night, around a hearth, attention turns inward toward one another. Expressions can be seen more clearly. Emotion becomes legible. Concern, grief, suspicion, relief, fatigue, amusement, all flicker visibly across features made unstable by flame. This may strengthen empathy, but it may also strengthen social discipline. A person who disrupts the calm of the fireside, ignores watch duties, wastes fuel, mishandles embers, or panics at the wrong moment affects everyone. Around fire, individual behavior becomes communal consequence in a more immediate way. Civilization will later build laws around shared vulnerability. The hearth teaches the lesson earlier and more intimately. The rhythm of repeated evenings also creates a template for ritual. Ritual does not need temples at first. It needs recurrence, significance, and a shared sense that certain actions matter when performed in certain ways. Fire encourages exactly that. This same place is prepared. The same materials are gathered. The same sequence of tending, feeding, protecting, and extinguishing is observed. The same hours of alertness give way to the same softer phases of speech and silence. Over time, patterns of behavior around the hearth likely accumulate meanings that exceed simple efficiency. Some gestures become proper, some timings feel important, some words belong near flame and not elsewhere, some acts are avoided. Scholars still debate how early ritualized fire use becomes, but no single explanation fully accounts for the emotional centrality of hearths, unless repetition itself is given weight. Humans do not just use the fire, they gather around its continuity. It is in this setting that story may begin doing one of its oldest jobs, containing the unknown without abolishing it. A fireside narrative does not make the storm vanish, or guarantee a successful hunt tomorrow. What it does is bring chaos into form. It gives a beginning, a sequence, a pattern, perhaps even a lesson. The child who hears of the ravine, the season of hunger, the place where the herd turned unexpectedly, inherits not only information but posture. fear becomes narratable. Once narratable, it becomes somewhat manageable. This is one of the quiet miracles of human culture. The thing that terrified the body in one generation becomes cautionary memory in the next. Firelight, by extending collective attention into the hours after labour, gives such transformation a setting in which to happen repeatedly. The edge of that light also creates one of the first profound oppositions in human symbolic life inside and outside. Inside the glow are kin, food, tools, warmth, and the known arrangement of bodies. Outside are predators, weather, rival groups, unseen terrain, and whatever else the darkness may conceal. This is not merely a spatial distinction. It becomes emotional and social. To be inside is to belong, at least for the night. To be outside is to be at risk, or to pose risk, over immense time. The logic expands. Villages, walls, thresholds, sanctuaries, and sacred precincts all operate on similar emotional foundations. They create zones where danger is believed to be managed and where order, however temporary, is reinforced. The first of those boundaries may be nothing more than a ring of firelight on cold ground. There is even reason to think that the management of fire helps train human patience and foresight. A flame cannot simply be admired, it must be maintained. Fuel must be gathered in advance. Embers may need preserving from one day to the next. Carelessness brings loss. This is a subtle discipline, but an important one. It links present action to future security in a vivid way. Neglect now means danger later. Attentiveness now means warmth later. Such repeated experiences may reinforce exactly the kind of time-conscious behavior that larger social systems will later require. The same species that learns to carry embers through the night may one day carry grain through the winter and obligations across generations. Fear of darkness helps make continuity valuable. And yet the deepest significance of fire may remain emotional rather than technical. Around it, humans discover that fear can be held at a distance without disappearing. They do not defeat the unknown, they illuminate just enough of it to live. That distinction matters. Civilization is often imagined as mastery, but its beginnings may lie more in managed exposure than in conquest. The first campfire does not tame the wilderness. It creates a temporary island where the wilderness can be endured. People sit within a small world they have made together and listen to the sounds beyond it. They feel safer, but never entirely safe. They speak, remember, teach, and keep watch. In that balance between protection and vulnerability, something essential to human civilization takes shape. Because the fire is more than heat. It is the first recurring center where fear is transformed into attention into memory, and memory into shared meaning. It does not end danger. It gives danger a border. It does not answer the unknown. It gives people a place from which to face it together. In the long dark before cities, that may be enough to begin changing everything. Once a group learns to endure the night from within a circle of light, the next transformation becomes possible. The danger outside the fire is no longer only physical, it begins to feel inhabited. Something is there beyond what the eyes can confirm, and if not something in the form of a beast or rival human, then something less visible and perhaps more unsettling because it cannot be tracked. A storm can now be remembered, discussed, and placed within a sequence. A death can be mourned around witnesses rather than absorbed alone in shock. A place can acquire memory, but the more humans gather experiences into patterns, the harder it becomes to leave those patterns empty. Fear does not like a vacant explanation. It pushes the mind to populate the unknown. This is one of the most delicate thresholds in the human story. because it concerns beings and forces that leave no bones, no footprints, no direct artifacts, only the indirect traces of minds that appear increasingly unwilling to treat the world as a blunt collection of visible causes. To name what cannot be seen is not necessarily to invent elaborate religion overnight. More often it begins in vaguer form, the sense that illness has an approach before it has symptoms, that a place can feel wrong before any harm occurs there, that the dead may not be wholly gone, that weather arrives not as mechanism but as mood or will. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how early these tendencies become socially stable. But what survives in the record suggests that at some point human beings begin living in a world layered with unseen presence. The path toward that world likely starts with a very ordinary feature of human cognition agency detection. The rustle in grass is treated as if something caused it intentionally, because that assumption is safer than indifference. A shadow at the edge of vision is handled as presence before it is dismissed as chance. This bias is deeply adaptive. It keeps bodies ready for danger, but once the same habit meets death, disease, weather, and coincidence, it no longer remains confined to the obvious world of animals and enemies. It starts reaching beyond what can be directly observed. If something terrible happens and no visible cause is sufficient, the mind still strains toward an actor. Behind the event, perhaps there is a force. Behind the force, perhaps a will. This does not mean the earliest humans are naively hallucinating beings into existence. It means they are responding in emotionally coherent ways to environments that often seem selective, dramatic, and morally suggestive even when they are not. One person dies while another survives the same fever. One shelter is struck by lightning and another spared. One hunt ends in abundance after a certain sequence of gestures or timing, while another fails after rules are neglected. Human memory is very good at holding on to meaningful coincidences, especially when fear gives those coincidences weight. Over time, repeated pairings of event and interpretation accumulate. The world begins to feel full of relations that are partly invisible but socially real. Ancestors may be among the earliest of these invisible presences, because the dead are uniquely difficult for the human mind to reduce to absence. A body lies still where a person recently acted, spoke, knew, and belonged. The shape remains, but the animating presence is gone. For a species increasingly capable of memory, that disappearance is profound. The person is absent physically in one sense, yet persists vividly in behavior, expectation, and emotion. People still move around where they once sat. Their skills are remembered. Their warnings remain valid. Their name, if names are already in use as fully as many scholars suspect for later prehistory, continues circulating after the body has failed. It is easy to see how the dead might become the first unseen beings who are not simply imagined from nature, but carried directly out of social experience. They were here, now they are not, yet in another sense they still are. Burial practices, where they appear, hint at this transition. The archaeological record is often frustratingly ambiguous. Some bodies seem carefully placed, some are accompanied by pigment, tools, or animal parts. Some may reflect deliberate protection from scavengers rather than symbolic care. Others may signal treatment far richer than simple disposal. Scholars still debate many cases, especially for very early burials and for non-sapiens humans, and no single explanation fully accounts for every site. Yet the broader pattern matters. Once the dead are handled in ways that exceed immediate practical necessity, a line has likely been crossed. The deceased are no longer only biological remains. They are socially potent, Something about them still matters. This matters because fear and grief are close companions. A group that has lost members does not merely mourn them, it may also fear what death means, where the dead have gone, whether they remain near, whether they can influence the living, whether death itself moves through the world as a presence rather than an event. Such thoughts need not yet form a complete doctrine of spirits. They only need to be plausible enough to shape conduct. A body may be treated carefully not because of abstract theology, but because indifference feels dangerous. Certain places of death may be avoided. Certain remains may be accompanied by objects, pigment, or positioning that imply continued relationship. The unseen enters human life not as philosophical speculation, but as behavior. Nature likely reinforces this process. Wind moving through a place once occupied by someone beloved, echoes in caves, dreams in which the dead appear with full vividness, the uncanny persistence of a voice in memory, a sudden animal presence near a burial site. All these can blend grief with interpretation. Dreams in particular may play a role larger than modern people often appreciate. In dreams, the absent return with extraordinary immediacy. The dead walk, speak, warn, accuse, or simply stand there as if distance between worlds does not exist. For people without a strict boundary between material explanation and symbolic reality, dreaming may offer powerful evidence that the invisible is not fantasy, but another layer of existence. Some anthropologists have long argued that dreams contribute significantly to ideas of spirits and ancestors, and while the evidence from prehistory can only be inferred, the psychological plausibility is strong. At the same time, not all unseen forces are personal in the sense of being recognizable individuals. Some may begin as less defined powers attached to locations, weather, fertility, illness, or luck. A spring may be approached with caution because it seems generous but moody. A cave may feel inhabited by something older than the group. A cliff edge where accidents repeat may become charged. Such places do not need statues or formal prayers to matter. They only need repeated emotional intensity. Human beings are exceptionally skilled at detecting significance through recurrence. If a particular site repeatedly hosts fear, awe, relief, or strange coincidence, it slowly becomes more than geography. It becomes inhabited in the broadest sense. There is a lesser-known clue to this in the way later sacred landscapes often emerge not in the most convenient places, but in places marked by acoustics, unusual geology, striking visual effects, difficult access, or sensory distortion, deep caves, echoing chambers, isolated springs, dramatic rock formations, and mountain edges all tend to attract ritual significance across cultures. That does not prove a universal prehistoric pattern, but it does suggest something important about the human mind. Unusual sensory environments are especially good at convincing people that ordinary reality has thinned. Where the world behaves strangely, invisible agency feels more plausible. Fear, awe, and interpretation converge there. To name such forces is an enormous social step because naming makes the invisible shareable. A private sense that a place feels wrong remains unstable. A spoken idea that something dwells there can be taught, repeated, and enforced. Names do not need to be complex. They may be little more than sound attached to warning or reverence. But once a force is nameable, it becomes easier to remember, easier to transmit, and easier to bind to action. Do not sleep there. Do not eat that first. Do not cross at night. Leave something behind. Speak softly. Return in season. Fear now has handles. The unknown becomes navigable not because it is understood in any modern scientific sense, but because it has entered collective language. This is also where social authority begins to find new ground. If unseen beings or forces are part of reality, then not everyone will claim equal sensitivity to them. Some individuals may seem especially attentive to signs, dreams, omens, or disturbances. Some may remember which acts preceded disaster and which seemed to avert it. Some may possess unusual calm in frightening moments, which alone can make them appear closer to hidden order. The group, still vulnerable and eager for patterns, will naturally begin weighting certain perceptions more heavily than others. Before priesthood in any formal sense, there may already be people whose authority comes from navigating the invisible more convincingly than the rest. The emotional payoff is substantial. A world filled with named unseen forces is still frightening, but it is less blank. Blankness is intolerable because it offers no relationship. The invisible, once named, can at least be approached, avoided, appeased, offended, remembered, or consulted. That is why naming what cannot be seen is not only an act of imagination, it is a survival strategy at the level of the mind. It converts raw dread into a world of possible responses. Even if the responses are mistaken in material terms, they reduce helplessness. They give the group scripts for action in the face of uncertainty. Of course, this new world also creates fresh dangers. Once invisible forces are admitted into explanation, almost anything can become charged with hidden consequence. Misfortune may no longer be random, but that means blame can attach where evidence is thin. A failed hunt may be linked to a taboo broken by someone vulnerable. An illness may be attributed to unseen offense rather than a practical source. Ambiguity becomes morally heavy. The cost of living in a meaningful universe is that meaning can wound as well as comfort. Civilization will inherit both sides of this bargain. The sacred can stabilize communities, but it can also deepen fear by giving it names that linger. Still, the larger transformation is unmistakable. Human beings no longer live only among animals, weather, terrain, and one another. They live among absences that feel present, places that seem charged, dreams that spill into waking life, and forces that cannot be seen but can increasingly be spoken about as though they matter. In that shift, the world becomes crowded, not materially crowded, but interpretively crowded. The visible is no longer enough, and once the visible is no longer enough, culture begins expanding into one of its most enduring dimensions, the management of invisible reality. That expansion will soon demand action. If there are powers behind illness, storm, death, or luck, then fear cannot remain passive. It must start experimenting with response. A gesture here, an offering there, a burial done carefully, a rule repeated, a dangerous place approached with caution and ceremony. The first ritual responses will not emerge because humans are suddenly irrational. They will emerge because once the unseen is admitted, behavior must adapt to it. Fear, having named what cannot be seen, will now try to negotiate with it. Once invisible forces begin to feel real, even in uncertain and shifting ways, human behavior changes almost immediately. Fear can endure a mystery for only so long before it starts testing responses. If a place seems dangerous beyond what the eye can explain, people begin entering it differently. If the dead feel socially present after death, their bodies are handled with more care than mere disposal requires. If storms, illness, or failed hunts seem tied to unseen intention, then the group will not remain still. It will try things. It will repeat what seems to coincide with safety. It will avoid what seems to precede loss. In this quiet experimental zone, between raw dread and formal religion, the first ritual responses begin to take shape. Ritual at this stage does not need temples, scriptures, or priestly systems. It only needs repetition under pressure, a gesture performed before crossing dangerous ground, a silence kept near the dead, a sequence of movements before sleep, a deliberate placement of bones, tools, pigment, or food, a refusal to speak certain words in certain places, a careful return to a site at the right season. These acts may look modest from the outside, but they carry enormous psychological weight. They translate fear into conduct. That translation matters because conduct can be shared, taught, and enforced. Once danger has a response attached to it, however uncertain that response may be, the group feels less exposed to chaos. This is one of the most important shifts in the long road towards civilization. Fear becomes procedural. Instead of existing only as an emotion, it begins generating sequences: do this, then wait, then watch. Such sequences may have practical foundations, symbolic meanings, or some blend of both. A burial rite may protect the living from scavengers and disease while also expressing a belief that the dead remain significant. A taboo around certain foods may preserve health in one environment while acquiring sacred justification in another. A rule against entering a cave at particular times may reflect real danger from predators or air quality, while also becoming charged with invisible consequence. No single explanation fully accounts for these practices because early ritual likely grows from overlap, not separation. Utility, memory, emotion, and imagination are braided together from the start. Archaeology offers fragmentary but compelling clues. Deliberate burials, where bodies are positioned rather than discarded, suggest that death is being treated as something socially meaningful. Use of ochre on the body or in burial contexts hints that colour itself may carry symbolic force. Repeated deposition of animal remains, objects, or carefully arranged materials in specific places may indicate acts that exceed simple waste or convenience. Some cave sites preserve evidence of deep interior visits far beyond what ordinary shelter would require, suggesting that certain spaces attract special attention even when they are difficult, dark, and impractical. Scholars still debate individual cases intensely, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests that humans are already doing more than surviving. They are marking, repeating, and formalizing responses to things that disturb or exceed ordinary life. Burial is especially revealing because it stands at the intersection of fear, grief, memory, and social continuity. A dead body is not only a practical problem, it is a crisis of meaning. Someone known to the group is suddenly present and absent at once. To bury the body carefully, to position it, to accompany it with objects, pigment, or animal parts, is to insist that death does not end relationship cleanly. It may also express caution. The dead can inspire tenderness, but also dread. If the boundary between life and death feels uncertain, then handling the body properly becomes more than custom. It becomes necessary. Some later societies fear the return of the dead, while others seek ancestral protection from them. In prehistory, the exact beliefs remain elusive, but the behavioral pattern itself is eloquent. The dead are being managed through repeated action. There is a lesser known but important possibility here. Some of the earliest ritual acts may have emerged not from confidence in what they accomplished, but from uncertainty about what might happen if they were neglected. This is a very human logic. It is safer to perform the act than to risk omission. Better to place the offering than discover too late that it mattered. Better to keep the silence than speak carelessly in a charged place. Better to repeat what elders insist upon than test the consequences of disregard. This is how rituals gain stability, even when their meanings are only partly understood by those performing them. Fear protects the pattern. Omission feels dangerous. Repetition feels safer. That same logic may help explain taboos, some of the earliest and most durable forms of social ritual. A taboo is powerful because it does not always need explanation proportional to its force. It simply needs to be framed as a boundary whose violation invites danger. Do not eat that animal now. Do not touch the body this way. Do not sleep there. Do not cross this threshold after dark. Do not mate within certain lines. Do not speak the name in the wrong place. Some of these rules may preserve ecological balance, kin structure, hygiene, or group stability. Others may be more arbitrary or symbolic. But all operate on a similar emotional structure, fear attached to boundary. Civilization will later build entire legal and religious systems on this principle. But its earlier form is ritual caution grounded in invisible risk. Ritual also helps solve a problem that fear alone cannot solve. Fear is destabilizing. It scatters attention, accelerates the body, narrows thought, and makes groups fragile if it spreads too far. Ritual, by contrast, channels fear into predictable movement. In moments of grief, threat, or uncertainty, repeated acts can steady the group. The act may not alter the storm or heal the illness, but it organizes human response. Bodies kneel, gather, place, wash, mark, chant, abstain, or carry. Through repetition, emotion acquires form. This is one reason ritual remains powerful across so many cultures even when beliefs differ dramatically. It offers structure where explanation fails. For prehistoric humans living close to danger, that structure may have been indispensable. The rise of offerings is especially telling. An offering only makes sense in a world where exchange with the unseen feels possible. Something is given because something might be returned, or because danger might be lessened, or because respect must be shown. The offering may be food, pigment, tools, animal parts, crafted objects, or even time and effort spent approaching a difficult site. It does not need to be extravagant. Its meaning lies in the act of transfer. Something valuable moves from human possession into another domain. This is a profound step. It assumes that human beings are not alone in the economy of consequence. Other powers matter too, and must be acknowledged. One can imagine how often such patterns begin by accident. A successful hunt follows a particular gesture, and the gesture is repeated. A burial performed with unusual care is followed by a season without sickness, and the manner becomes precedent. A group leaves food at a place associated with unease, and nothing bad happens there for a time. Correlation becomes significance. Significance becomes memory. Memory becomes rule. Modern minds are tempted to dismiss this as error, but that misses the deeper truth. Human beings are building systems under conditions of radical uncertainty. They are searching for controllable patterns in a world that offers few guarantees. Ritual is not the opposite of intelligence. It is intelligence working under emotional strain, often with incomplete information, trying to make the unbearable more navigable. There is also an aesthetic dimension beginning to appear. Ochre, beads, carved objects, arranged bones, selected materials, and repeated visual marks suggest that early ritual is not purely verbal or practical. It recruits color, texture, shape, and placement. Why should this matter? Because beauty, pattern, and emphasis help fix significance in the mind. A body marked with red is no longer merely a body. A stone placed carefully in relation to others is no longer random debris. A cave wall bearing deliberate signs is no longer only rock. The special must look special if it is to hold emotional authority. This is one reason ritual and symbolism so often grow together. Fear needs visible anchors. At the same time, ritual increases social differentiation. Not everyone may know the right sequence. Not everyone may be trusted to perform it. Some individuals remember the forms more precisely, remain calmer in moments of danger, or seem especially sensitive to what the group fears. Even before formal specialists emerge, the ground is being prepared for them. A person who knows how to bury properly, where to leave an offering, when to abstain, or how to read the charged mood of a place begins to matter more than others in certain situations. Fear, once ritualized, creates expertise. Expertise, once socially valued, begins producing authority. The darker side is already present as well. If safety depends on correct performance, then failure becomes morally loaded. A bad season may be blamed on neglected rites. Illness may be linked to broken taboo. Misfortune may invite accusations even where evidence is weak. This sacred from its earliest forms offers reassurance but also intensifies scrutiny. A world of ritual is a world where actions carry hidden consequences. That can preserve social discipline. It can also produce anxiety that spreads beyond the original danger. Scholars still debate how coercive such systems become in different prehistoric settings, but the potential is there from the beginning. Fear tamed by ritual does not disappear. It changes shape and sometimes turns inward. Still, the broader effect is cumulative and transformative. Human groups are no longer meeting danger only with instinct, memory, and practical adaptation. They are building formalized responses to invisible uncertainty. They are rehearsing the future of culture. Every repeated burial, every offering, every charged prohibition, every ceremonial approach to a dangerous or meaningful place adds another layer to collective life. The group becomes more than a cluster of survivors. It becomes a keeper of procedures that connect the living, the dead, the land, and the unseen. That is why the first ritual responses matter so much. They are not decorative additions to survival. They are survival expanded into meaning, performance, and order. They teach human beings that fear can be answered not only with running or hiding, but with patterned acts performed together. The storm may still come. The dead may still die. Hunger may still return. But now there are things to do. Hands know where to place the body. Feet know how to approach the cave. Voices know when to fall silent. Objects know where they belong. In a world that rarely offers certainty, ritual creates the next best thing, the feeling that uncertainty has been met, shaped, and held within a human form. Once ritual begins to stabilize fear, another figure starts to emerge from the edge of the firelight, the person who seems able to go further into uncertainty than others without breaking. Not a ruler in any later political sense. Not yet a priest in the fully institutional form that cities will one day produce, but someone marked by a dangerous kind of usefulness. In every vulnerable human group, there are moments when ordinary skill no longer feels sufficient. A hunt fails for reasons no one can explain. A child burns with fever. Dreams unsettle the camp. An elder dies after speaking strangely. The weather shifts against memory. A place once safe begins to feel wrong. At such moments, it is not enough to have strong hunters or careful gatherers. The group begins to value another sort of specialist, someone who can interpret fear itself. This person may first stand out not because of official status, but because of temperament. Some individuals remain calm where others fray. Some notice small irregularities and remember them. Some speak persuasively after a crisis and make events feel less chaotic. Some enter caves, burial spaces, or charged landscapes with unusual composure. Some dream intensely, fall ill and recover, or seem altered by solitude, fasting, grief, or trance-like states that others find unsettling but meaningful. In later anthropology, such people are often grouped, sometimes too loosely, under names like shaman, healer, diviner, seer, or ritual specialist. Prehistory does not give us those titles neatly. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how early such roles become distinct. But what survives in human behavior across many cultures suggests that once a society believes the unseen matters, certain people will gain influence by claiming unusual access to it. The emotional logic is straightforward. If danger now includes invisible causes, then practical competence alone cannot fully reassure the group. Someone must be able to read signs, connect events, and perform responses with greater authority than ordinary members. The person who does so becomes valuable not because they abolish uncertainty, but because they make it narratable and manageable. Illness is no longer just suffering, it can be interpreted. A failed hunt is no longer just bad luck. It can be placed within a sequence of imbalance, offense, neglect, or warning. A disturbing dream can be translated into advice. A death can be folded into communal understanding, instead of remaining a raw tear in the group sense of order. These interpretations may be inaccurate in material terms, but materially inaccurate explanations can still be socially stabilizing. That is part of their power. There is likely another reason such specialists emerge. Fear is exhausting, and most people cannot dwell in it continuously without losing clarity. The group therefore benefits from assigning some part of that burden to individuals who seem capable of holding it. The ritual specialist becomes, in one sense, a custodian of dread. They go where others hesitate to go, physically or psychologically. They handle the dead. They enter dark spaces. They speak over the sick. They remember prohibitions. They repeat stories of catastrophe and survival. They carry the symbolic weight of things others would rather not confront directly. This division of emotional labor is easy to underestimate, but it may be one of the earliest foundations of social specialization. Human groups do not only divide tasks around food, tools, and movement. They divide them around the management of fear. Archaeology gives only glimpses of such people, and even those are disputed. Some burials stand out because of unusual grave goods, distinctive bodily treatment, pigments, animal remains, or signs that the individual may have occupied a special position in life. Certain artifacts found in later prehistoric contexts suggest costume, performance, or ritual role. Cave art, masks, hybrid beings, altered body postures, and unusual deposits may hint at symbolic specialists moving between ordinary and charged domains. But no single explanation fully accounts for such evidence. An ornate burial does not automatically prove a shaman. A strange figurine does not automatically reveal a seer. The temptation to read later categories too neatly into earlier periods is real. Still, the broader pattern remains persuasive. As ritual thickens and invisible causes become socially important, expertise in that invisible realm becomes valuable enough to shape status. Dreams likely play a major role in this development. In a world where the boundary between waking and unseen reality is already porous, dreams are not dismissed as mere internal noise. They may be treated as encounters, warnings, journeys, or revelations. A person whose dreams are vivid, recurrent, or strangely confirmed by later events would be difficult for the group to ignore. That individual may become a source of guidance precisely because dreams seem to bypass ordinary perception. Likewise, illness itself may confer a kind of authority. In many later societies, ritual specialists are people who have passed through some destabilizing ordeal, surviving fever, seizure, isolation, grief, or psychological rupture that others interpret as contact with hidden powers. It is plausible that very early human groups noticed similar transformations. A person altered by suffering yet returned to usefulness may appear to have crossed a threshold others fear. The role of healer may emerge alongside this. Not all invisible danger is social or moral. Much of it is bodily. Infection, injury, childbirth, weakness, wasting disease, and mental disturbance threaten every group. Those who learn plants, touch, timing, or methods that sometimes help would naturally gather respect, but healing in prehistory may rarely be purely medicinal in a narrow sense. The body is treated within a framework where emotion, taboo, ancestors, weather, and unseen forces all matter together. A healer does not simply apply a substance. They interpret, chant, restrict, mark, comfort, and position the patient within a wider order. This integrated role makes sense in a world where practical and symbolic causes are not sharply separated. The healer is effective not only when a remedy works, but when the group feels that the illness has been confronted with the right seriousness and form. Once certain individuals gain reputation in these ways, social influence begins to follow. The group asks them where to camp, when to move, how to bury, whether a sign matters, what a dream means, how to respond to failure, which taboo has been violated, whether the dead are at peace, whether a place may be entered, whether a hunt should proceed. Influence born this way is different from brute dominance. It rests less on strength than on interpretation. That distinction matters enormously for the history of civilization. Long before bureaucrats and kings, humans may already be granting power to people who organize uncertainty through meaning. In that sense, spiritual authority may be one of the oldest forms of leadership. This authority, however, is never simple. The ritual specialist is both useful and dangerous. Useful because the group needs coherence. Dangerous because anyone who claims access to hidden causes acquires leverage over behavior that cannot be easily checked. If misfortune follows disobedience, their status rises. If success follows a rite they prescribe, their prestige deepens. If they alone can interpret dreams, illness, omens, or ancestral moods, then they hold a kind of monopoly over fear. The darker potential is obvious. Uncertainty can be managed, but it can also be exploited. The earliest roots of sacred authority already contain the seeds of control. There is a lesser-known psychological dimension here as well. People often trust specialists not only because of what those specialists know, but because certainty itself is calming. A confident interpretation, even when weakly supported, can feel better than an honest admission of confusion. In dangerous conditions, the person who speaks with conviction about unseen forces may therefore seem wiser than the person who says the evidence is incomplete. This creates a strong selection pressure in social terms. Those who can frame uncertainty with authority may gather followers even when their actual insight is limited. Scholars still debate how often ritual specialists sincerely believe their own claims versus strategically using them, and the answer likely varies widely. But the structural point remains: fear rewards interpreters. At the same time, many such individuals are probably not cynical at all. They may genuinely experience altered states, symbolic dreams, heightened intuitions, and deep emotional attunement to the group. Their role may be as much burden as privilege, to carry others' dread, to be summoned in illness and death, to enter charged places, to hold memory of taboos and losses, to remain awake when others rest. All this takes a cost. The ritual specialist may be both elevated and isolated, needed yet set apart. Separation itself can deepen the impression that they are closer to other realms than ordinary people. Special clothing, pigments, scars, ornaments, or behaviors may emerge partly to mark that difference. The person who interprets fear must, in some sense, appear touched by what others fear. This creates an early model of social hierarchy based not on possessions, but on proximity to the unseen. A person matters because they are believed to stand closer to dangerous truth. That model will later become foundational in temples, courts, and empires where sacred office legitimizes political rule. But its earlier form is smaller, more intimate, and perhaps more fragile. Around the fire, the seer, healer, or dream knower is not distant from the people. They live among them. Their authority rises and falls with visible outcomes, remembered predictions, emotional skill, and the group's shifting tolerance for ambiguity. Still, once such roles exist, human society has changed. Not everyone now faces the unknown on equal terms. There are traces of this shift in the way some communities begin to distinguish between ordinary spaces and ritual spaces, ordinary acts and charged acts, ordinary bodies and marked bodies. The specialist often stands at the crossing point. They guide burial. They conduct offerings. They interpret unusual animal behavior. They respond to dreams and illness. They mediate between what is feared and what is done. In doing so, they transform shared anxiety into organized action once again. But now with themselves at the center of that transformation. Fear no longer merely generates ritual, it generates office. And office, however embryonic, changes the whole group. Younger people can be apprenticed into forms of knowledge not everyone receives equally. Memory can be concentrated as well as shared. Certain myths, sequences, and prohibitions may become guarded rather than fully public. Performance may grow more formal. Signs of legitimacy may matter. The person who can say, with apparent authority, "This is why the child is sick. This is how the dead must be treated. This is why the hunt failed. This is what the dream requires," becomes a node around which social order begins to organize. Civilization will later call such people priests, prophets, diviners, doctors, judges, and kings. Their distant ancestor may simply be the one who knows how to stand closest to the dark and return with an answer. That answer does not have to be true in a modern scientific sense to be historically decisive. It only has to bind the group, direct behavior, and reduce the feeling of helplessness enough to preserve cohesion. This is why shamans, seers, and early specialists matter so much in the story of civilization. They show the moment when fear stops being only a common condition and starts becoming a managed domain, one that can be interpreted by experts, transmitted through ritual, and linked to authority. Once that happens, culture gains a new structure. Some people now speak for the invisible, others listen, and from that asymmetry, the architecture of power begins to rise. Once fear has interpreters, it begins to leave even deeper marks on ordinary life. What was once an emergency response to danger now settles into patterns that shape how people eat, mate, bury, sleep, move, obey, and belong. This is the moment when fear stops being merely a force that strikes human communities from outside and becomes part of the internal architecture by which communities are built. The group no longer gathers only because the world is dangerous. It starts arranging itself so that danger can be anticipated, distributed, and morally contained. In that sense, fear becomes social architecture long before architecture becomes stone. The process is gradual, almost invisible while it is happening. A warning repeated often enough becomes a rule. A rule attached to invisible consequence becomes a taboo. A taboo passed across generations becomes custom. A custom linked to survival, ancestry, or sacred order becomes something very difficult to question. No one needs to sit down and invent society from first principles. It forms through accumulated caution. Do not sleep too far from the center. Do not cross certain boundaries alone. Do not touch food before it is shared properly. Do not mate within prohibited lines. Do not leave the dead unattended. Do not ignore the dreams of certain people. Do not hunt when signs are wrong. Some of these instructions preserve practical safety. Others preserve emotional stability. Many do both at once. Together they begin to shape the invisible framework of communal life. Food is one of the clearest places where this happens. Hunting and gathering are never just technical tasks. They are loaded with risk, chance, and social consequence. A failed hunt is hunger. A poisoned plant is sickness. Unequal sharing is resentment. Careless waste is danger deferred into the future. It is therefore unsurprising that food often attracts rules stronger than mere convenience. Who eats first? What may be eaten? When it may be eaten? What must be avoided? How a kill is handled? What belongs to the living and what belongs to the dead? All these can become ritually charged. Scholars still debate the exact origins of many early food taboos, but no single explanation fully accounts for their persistence unless fear is part of the answer. Food enters the body. Anything entering the body can carry life or disaster. That alone makes it a natural site for sacred caution. Sex and kinship become equally charged, perhaps even more so, because they govern the most unstable mix of desire, reproduction, inheritance, alliance, and conflict. In small groups, mating cannot be left entirely to impulse without consequences. Jealousy can fracture cooperation. Incest can damage long-term group health. Though prehistoric people would not have understood genetics in any modern sense, alliances between families or neighbouring bands can ease tension or provoke it. Childbirth is both necessary and dangerous. Women, men, children, elders, and new unions all occupy positions that matter not just emotionally, but structurally. Fear enters here through vulnerability. If the group is fragile, then the making of new members and the relationships between existing ones cannot remain morally neutral. Rules form around who may approach whom, when, under what conditions, after which rites, during which bodily states. The body itself becomes part of the sacred map of risk. Death, of course, remains at the centre of all this. Once the dead are treated as socially potent, every community must decide how to position itself in relation to them. Are the dead kept near, remembered, fed symbolically, or separated? Are some deaths more dangerous than others? Is the person who touches the corpse marked for a time? Does grief require visible performance, silence, abstinence, or isolation? These are not small ceremonial details. They are social technologies for containing one of the most destabilizing facts of existence. A group that cannot manage death emotionally will struggle to manage anything else. This is why mortuary behavior becomes such a revealing field for archaeologists. It shows how a society distributes fear, obligation, and memory around the most absolute human threshold. There is a lesser known but crucial feature of this process. Rules gain force when their consequences are partly invisible. A practical instruction can be debated because its effects are observable. A sacred instruction tied to unseen danger is harder to test. If someone breaks a taboo and nothing happens immediately, the group can still maintain the rule by attributing later misfortune to the violation. This makes fear-based norms remarkably durable. They do not depend on immediate proof. They depend on the possibility that proof may come too late. Better not to risk it. This logic, once embedded in daily life, can regulate behavior with extraordinary efficiency. It turns uncertainty itself into enforcement. Territory begins to acquire the same structure. The landscape is no longer only divided by resource value or travel convenience. It is divided by emotional and sacred intensity. Some areas are safe for dwelling, some are safe only in certain seasons. Some belong to the dead. Some are approached through ritual. Some are dangerous not because they are physically lethal every time, but because they are associated with loss, strange events, or ancestral power. What survives in the record suggests that humans increasingly inhabit landscapes layered with social meaning rather than mere geography. Paths, caves, water sources, high places, burial grounds, and hunting zones can all carry invisible boundaries. In this way, fear helps transform open terrain into lived territory. That transformation is important because territory is one of the foundations of future civilization. Before land can be owned, defended, taxed, cultivated, or sanctified in any later formal sense, it must first matter differently in different places. Fear helps produce that differentiation. A place remembered for catastrophe or charged with ritual significance is already no longer neutral ground. It has become part of a shared mental map. Once that happens, movement through the world is no longer only physical. It is moral and symbolic as well. People do not simply go where they can. They go where they should, where they are permitted, where the ancestors approve, where danger is containable, where the group has learned how to behave. Obedience grows inside this web almost naturally, not the obedience of states with written law and formal punishment, but something earlier and often more intimate. A child learns not to disobey because elders are merely stronger, but because elders are thought to know where danger lies. An adult respects certain restrictions because the cost of defiance may fall on everyone. Group survival turns behavior into a collective concern. The person who ignores ritual before a hunt, mishandles the dead, violates a food prohibition, or crosses a charged boundary carelessly does not just endanger themselves. They threaten the social order through which fear has been managed. This is one of the earliest routes by which communities begin moralizing conduct. Good behavior becomes whatever helps keep chaos outside the group. It is tempting to imagine this moralization as oppressive from the beginning, but that would be too narrow. Many such rules likely feel protective, even comforting. To live in a world full of unpredictable threats is exhausting. To know that there are ways to behave that line one with safety, ancestors, seasons, and communal expectation can ease that burden. Rules reduce decision fatigue. They make the world legible. They tell people what kind of body to be, what kind of eater to be, what kind of mourner to be, what kind of relative to be. Fear, once translated into norm, gives identity shape. A person knows who they are partly because they know what dangers they are taught to avoid and which obligations they are taught to honor. At the same time, no single explanation fully accounts for how much of this structure comes from fear alone. Cooperation, affection, reciprocity, parental care, play, curiosity, and shared pleasure all matter too. Human societies are not built only out of dread, but fear has a special organizing power because it turns mistakes into existential threats. A broken sharing norm can mean starvation. A violated kinship pattern can mean internal conflict. A neglected burial can mean spiritual danger. A reckless move across territory can mean attack, accident, or pollution. Under such conditions, rules harden quickly. Emotional stakes accelerate social form. There is also an accumulating asymmetry hidden here. Once fear-based norms govern food, sex, death, and territory, those who interpret or guard those norms gain leverage. Elders, specialists, lineage figures, ritual leaders, and skilled survivors begin carrying more authority not only in crisis, but in ordinary life. Daily behavior can now be judged against sacred or ancestral expectation. This is a significant step beyond simple competence. It means power is beginning to attach to invisible order. The person who says this marriage is wrong, this burial improper, this food forbidden, this place restricted, is shaping society from within its most intimate routines. Civilization will later scale this mechanism upward into law, priesthood, and social rank. But its early form may be nothing more than collective fear deposited into custom. Even bodily states may become architecturally important. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, adolescence, illness, sexual maturity, injury, old age, and death all expose the body as unstable, permeable, and vulnerable. In many later cultures, these states are surrounded by ritual handling, separation, restrictions, or special protections. Prehistory cannot be read too confidently through those later examples, but the pattern is suggestive. Bodies at thresholds often generate rules because thresholds are frightening. Something is changing, and change is dangerous when the causes and consequences are only partly understood. Fear therefore helps organize not just society at large, but the body's life course within society. Over time, all these layers begin to reinforce one another. Food rules connect to kinship, kinship connects to burial, burial connects to ancestors, ancestors connect to territory, territory connects to seasonal movement and ritual specialists. Specialists connect to obedience. Obedience connects back to survival. The result is not yet civilization as later ages would recognize it, but it is already more than a band responding ad hoc to immediate danger. It is a social world arranged around invisible pressures and shared boundaries. A community begins to feel like a structure people live inside rather than a temporary alliance they happen to inhabit. That may be the deepest significance of this stage. Fear has been converted into something durable. It no longer needs a storm, a death, or a sudden attack to assert itself. It is built into expectations, taboos, places, schedules, relationships, and bodily conduct. It survives in memory and behavior even when immediate danger is absent. This is what architecture does at its most powerful. It shapes action before people consciously choose it. Fear-based norms do the same. They tell bodies where to stand, when to speak, what to eat, whom to touch, and how to respond to the dead. Long before walls and roads, human beings are already living inside structures made of collective anxiety, sacred meaning, and repeated restraint. And that is precisely why the next development becomes possible. Once fear has shaped the rules of life, it also begins shaping the spaces where those rules are concentrated and performed. Some places will soon matter more than others, not because they provide the best shelter or the richest game, but because they become focal points where uncertainty can be faced together and transformed into meaning. The world is no longer just occupied, It is marked. Sacred places, in that sense, are the next natural step in the architecture fear has already begun to build. By the time fear has settled into rules, taboos, and shared routines, the landscape itself can no longer remain ordinary. Some places begin to gather more meaning than others, not because they are the easiest places to live, but because they seem closer to whatever lies behind danger, luck, death, and memory. A cave deep in the earth, a hilltop exposed to sky and storm, a spring that never seems to fail, a clearing where the dead are placed, a ring of stones no one crosses casually, a ravine known for echoes that sound too much like voices. These places become charged. They are not simply used, they are approached, they are remembered, they are treated differently. In this way, fear begins shaping not just behavior, but geography. The world becomes uneven with significance. This is a profound change in human life because it creates focal points where the invisible can be handled collectively. A dangerous event may happen anywhere, but once people start returning to particular places to respond to danger, those places take on a new function. They become zones of concentration. Grief is brought there, offerings are left there, warnings are retold there, bodies are buried there, silence is kept there. Repetition slowly transforms them from locations into institutions of a kind, even if no walls yet define them. What survives in the record suggests that long before cities, humans are already marking parts of the landscape as more than practical space. Certain sites draw repeated activity for reasons that exceed shelter, hunting, or immediate survival. That excess is where the sacred begins to appear in durable form. Caves are among the clearest examples because they sit at the intersection of utility, fear, and symbolic imagination. Some caves are simple shelters, and many prehistoric people use them as such, but others, especially deep cave systems requiring deliberate entry into darkness, seem to attract a different kind of attention. The archaeological evidence from later prehistoric periods shows art, hand stencils, animal figures, abstract signs, torches, pigments, and repeated visits to spaces far removed from ordinary living areas. Scholars still debate the exact meanings of these acts, and no single explanation fully accounts for all cave use. Some see ritual initiation, some see altered states, some emphasize acoustics, social memory, or symbolic cosmology. Yet beneath these interpretations lies a more basic truth. Humans repeatedly enter places that intensify uncertainty, sensory distortion, and dependence on collective guidance. In the deep cave, fear is not avoided, it is staged. That matters because a sacred place is not always designed to feel safe. Often it is designed, or rather selected, to feel powerful. A cave narrows the body, swallows light, distorts sound, and removes ordinary visual anchors. Time changes there. Distance changes there. The difference between inside and outside becomes absolute. Such environments are ideal for transforming emotion. A group entering together does not simply move through rock. It passes into a domain where ordinary life loses its clarity. The unseen feels close because the seen has become unstable. This is one reason caves across many times and cultures retain sacred force. They resemble thresholds. And thresholds are exactly where fear and meaning meet. High places produce a different version of the same effect. A mountain ledge, hilltop, or open ridge exposes people to weather, sky, and distance in ways that can feel both exalting and dangerous. Storms are felt sooner there. Horizons widen. Human bodies seem smaller. Lightning, wind, and silence all take on an intensified character. Later societies will repeatedly place shrines, altars, and observatories on elevated ground, but the impulse may be older than any formal monument. A high place is where the powers of the sky feel near and where ordinary settlement seems to fall away below. It is not difficult to see why such sites might become destinations for observation, offerings, or rites tied to weather, ancestors, or celestial order. Burial grounds create another kind of sacred geography, one rooted not in altitude or darkness but in continuity with the dead. To place bodies repeatedly in the same area is to create a landscape of memory. The living now move around a visible concentration of absence that feels socially potent. Over time, such places can anchor identity. This is where our people are. This is where the old ones remain. This is ground that holds more than soil and bone. Burial grounds may also stabilize territory by tying lineage and belonging to place. A group that returns to its dead returns not only out of grief, but out of recognition that identity has become spatial. Scholars still debate how early such patterns consolidate into long-term ancestral landscapes. But what survives in the record suggests that repeated mortuary practice gives land emotional depth that mere use cannot provide. There is a lesser-known but revealing factor in the sacred use of place acoustics. Some caves, rock shelters, and cliff faces produce echoes, resonances, and strange sound distortions that can be deeply affecting, especially in darkness or under ritual conditions. Research in rock art studies has sometimes found correlations between marked areas and acoustically unusual spaces, though interpretations remain contested. Still, the principle is compelling. A place that alters the human voice, returns it from nowhere, or magnifies a drumbeat into something larger than the body can easily feel inhabited. Sound becomes a kind of evidence for presence. In such settings, fear and awe reinforce each other. The landscape seems to answer. Stone circles, arranged posts, marked clearings, and deliberately modified spaces add another layer. Once people begin shaping a place to hold repeated meaning, sacred geography becomes more visible and more social. The arrangement itself teaches behavior. Enter here. Stand there. Leave this untouched. Face that direction. Gather in this season. What was once only remembered can now be encoded materially. The earlier such constructions are often debated, and many sites remain difficult to interpret with confidence. Yet the larger point does not depend on any single monument. As soon as space is deliberately ordered around invisible significance, humans are doing something civilization will later do everywhere, building environments that stabilize shared belief. Sacred places also create safer worlds in a specific psychological sense. They do not eliminate danger outside, but they provide locations where danger can be symbolically contained, interpreted, and negotiated. A hunting range may be unpredictable, but a sacred site offers recurrence. One returns to it knowing what should happen there. The sequence of acts is familiar. The group gathers in recognizable form. Specialists know their roles. Offerings are made in expected ways. Songs, silences, markings, or gestures occur on known ground. This predictability is immensely valuable in lives otherwise governed by unstable weather, uncertain food, illness, and death. Sacred places are emotional machines for transforming open-ended fear into bounded experience. That does not mean they are peaceful in every sense. Some sacred sites likely inspire dread precisely because they are thought to be dangerous if approached wrongly. One does not wander casually through a burial zone, deep cave, or charged spring. The sacred often intensifies fear by concentrating it. But concentrated fear is easier to manage than fear spread everywhere. A place where the unknown can be approached under rules is less terrifying than a world where the unknown might erupt without form or boundary at any moment. This is one of the quiet achievements of sacred geography. It takes diffuse anxiety and gives it an address. These places also deepen social cohesion. To gather at a site that matters to everyone is to reinforce the sense that the group shares not only food and kin, but a common relationship to invisible reality. Children learn where to be silent. Adults learn where to remember the dead. Specialists perform their knowledge before witnesses. Elders connect present actions to earlier visits. The site itself becomes a teacher. It holds memory outside any one body. This is an important step toward institutional life. Civilization depends on durable locations where collective meaning can outlast individual lifespans. Sacred places may be among the first such locations humans ever created. There is another consequence as well. Once certain places matter more than others, movement through the landscape becomes scheduled and patterned in new ways. Groups may travel not only for food or migration, but to return to sacred sites at particular times. Seasonal gatherings can form around these returns. Alliances may be renewed there. Exchange, marriage, mourning, and ritual may overlap. A site first valued for fear and awe may gradually become a node of larger social integration. Some archaeologists have argued that certain early monumental or ritually important sites may have drawn dispersed groups together before permanent settlement fully developed around them. The evidence varies by region and period, but the underlying mechanism is plausible. Sacred places gather people before states do. This gathering function is especially important because it hints at how civilization can grow from emotional need as much as economic necessity. People do not only come together where food is stored or trade is convenient. They come together where meaning is concentrated. If the right cave, hill, or ancestral ground matters enough, humans will travel, coordinate, remember calendars, and maintain social ties partly for its sake. No single explanation fully accounts for large-scale cooperation in prehistory, but sacred sites may be one of the bridges between small band life and more complex forms of assembly. Fear, once localized and ritualized, can help produce larger human worlds. At the same time, sacred geography carries the seeds of exclusion and control. If some places are holier, more dangerous, or more restricted than others, then access becomes a question of status. Who may enter? Who may perform rites? Who belongs among the dead? Who controls the offerings? Who interprets what the place requires? These are still early developments, but they matter. The moment space becomes sacred, it can also become hierarchical. Not everyone stands in the same relation to it. Civilization will later multiply this pattern through temples, palaces, sanctuaries, and forbidden precincts. The earliest version may be nothing more than a cave wall in torchlight or a burial ground beyond the main camp, but the structural logic is already there. So when sacred places begin to define safer worlds, the phrase safer must be understood carefully. These places are not safer because they remove risk in any objective sense. They are safer because they create known forms for approaching risk. They stabilize emotion, preserve memory, gather people, and anchor invisible order in the physical world. They give fear a stage, and in doing so they make fear more governable. That is one of the first great achievements of culture. Not the abolition of danger, but the creation of places where danger can be faced through shared meaning. By now the path towards civilization is becoming clearer. Fear has moved from reflex to memory, from memory to shared dread, from shared dread to ritual, from ritual to specialists, from specialists to social rules, and from those rules into the landscape itself. The next step is not simply more symbolism, it is a change in scale. Once sacred order and social caution have become powerful enough, they begin shaping communities not only around episodic fear, but around daily obedience and more permanent life. The world is no longer just survived, it is being organized. Once fear has found its places, its specialists and its rules, it no longer waits for catastrophe to make itself felt. It begins shaping ordinary life from the inside. The group wakes, eats, works, mates, mourns, and moves within a structure already prepared by older anxieties. What had once been a response to storms, death, illness, darkness, and uncertain landscapes now becomes something broader and more durable, a system of obedience. Not obedience in the fully developed sense of written law, armed enforcement, or royal decree, but something older and in some ways more intimate. People begin doing what they do, not only because it works, but because not doing it feels dangerous in ways that may be invisible, delayed, or collective. This is one of the deepest transformations in the long prehistory of civilization. Survival starts becoming inseparable from compliance. That change matters because there is a limit to what small groups can achieve through improvisation alone. A band can react fluidly to immediate threats, but as social life becomes denser, as rituals multiply, as the dead matter more, as places become charged, and as specialists gain authority, too much improvisation becomes destabilizing. The world is already uncertain enough. Human communities therefore begin reducing internal uncertainty wherever they can. They establish expected sequences, expected roles, expected timings, expected silences, expected permissions. Someone goes first, someone does not. Some acts require witnesses, some require abstinence, some require cleansing, marking, or waiting. Over time, the question shifts from what is useful in this moment to what is proper, according to the shared order that has been built around generations of fear. This is where ritual begins reaching beyond exceptional moments and into ordinary behavior. A burial rite was already a formal response to death. A cave rite was already a formal response to the sacred unknown. But now similar logic starts governing the quieter fabric of social existence. Meals may need correct distribution. Sexual unions may require recognition or restriction. Children may need to pass through marked thresholds of belonging. Hunters may need abstinence or preparation before departure. People who touch blood, death, or sickness may be separated temporarily before rejoining the group. None of this requires a centralized state. It only requires a community convinced that correct behavior protects not just individuals, but the whole fragile arrangement through which chaos has been kept at bay. There is a lesser known but important psychological reason why such systems become powerful. Fear is easier to tolerate when it can be translated into obligations. If the world is dangerous but one knows what must be done, then anxiety becomes partially actionable. Action lowers helplessness. But obligations do more than soothe the individual. They synchronize the group. Everyone knows the sequence. Everyone knows the risk of error. Everyone knows that being careless is not merely foolish, but socially threatening. This creates a profound emotional pressure toward conformity. In a world where one broken taboo might later be blamed for sickness, failed hunting, or misfortune, disobedience becomes heavy even when proof is impossible. Better to submit to the rule than invite danger with one's name attached. Submission, in this early sense, is not always resented. Often it is welcomed because it offers structure. Modern people, especially those living under strong ideals of personal autonomy, can easily underestimate how attractive predictable order is in conditions of chronic instability. A rule about food, a sequence for mourning, a prohibition around sacred space, a proper way to greet birth, adulthood, or death. All these reduce the burden of constant decision-making. They tell people how to move through danger. They make identity legible. A person knows they are a proper member of the group because they know the forms. In that sense, obedience is not only imposed from above, it is also embraced from within as a way of living inside a meaningful world. Still, the consequences are profound. Once correct behavior is tied to collective security, those who define correctness gain leverage. Elders, ritual specialists, lineage authorities, and experienced survivors can increasingly direct action in domains that are no longer open to casual negotiation. If the sacred order requires a thing, argument becomes harder. The evidence remains incomplete on how rigid such structures become in different prehistoric settings, and no single explanation fully accounts for the balance between flexibility and control across all early societies. Yet the general pattern is clear enough. Behavior justified by invisible consequence is easier to enforce than behavior justified only by visible utility. The unseen strengthens authority. This is also where settlement, in its earliest forms, begins to take on a new emotional meaning. A camp or repeated dwelling area is no longer merely where the group happens to stop. It becomes a regulated space. Hearths have their positions. Sleeping arrangements may reflect age, kinship, vulnerability, or ritual status. Sacred objects or remains may have designated locations. Entry and exit may be patterned. Certain zones may be clean and others dangerous. The inside and outside of communal life become more sharply distinguished. To belong is increasingly to know where one should be and how one should act within shared space. Civilization will later amplify this into houses, compounds, neighborhoods, walls, and civic zones. But the template begins when communal life becomes morally organized rather than merely physically co-located. One can see this especially clearly in the treatment of thresholds, doorways, hearth edges, burial margins, cave mouths, boundaries between camp and wilderness, and stages of the life cycle all attract rules because thresholds are where uncertainty concentrates. A threshold is neither fully one thing nor another. It is the point of passage, and passage is dangerous. Many later societies surround thresholds with ritual because change itself is feared. Prehistory likely contains the early forms of the same logic: the child becoming adult, the pregnant body nearing birth, the sick person returning or failing to return, the hunter leaving camp and returning with meat or not returning at all. All these are moments when ordinary categories shake. Rules around them stabilize the transition, and therefore stabilize the group. From survival to obedience is not, however, a simple fall into repression. It also allows larger and more reliable forms of cooperation. A group in which everyone follows agreed sequences around hunting, sharing, death, and sacred space can coordinate more effectively than one governed only by moment-to-moment preference. The discipline required to preserve embers, wait for the right season, respect marriage patterns, or gather for ritual at the proper place trains people to live inside delayed gratification and collective expectation. This is a quiet but crucial step toward the later capacities civilization will demand, storing grain rather than eating it all at once, laboring for a future harvest, building structures no one person can complete alone, honoring agreements across time, and submitting to roles that outlast immediate desire. Fear-based obedience may therefore have a developmental role far beyond ritual life itself. Scholars have long debated whether religion and social hierarchy arise mainly as tools of control, or whether they first emerge as adaptive frameworks for cooperation and meaning. The answer is likely both, depending on time and place. Early obedience systems may genuinely protect vulnerable groups by reducing risky behavior and strengthening cohesion. But once such systems exist, they are also available for expansion, manipulation, and unequal benefit. A specialist who can say this person must abstain. This body is impure. This lineage has precedence. This place is forbidden. This union is unacceptable, is already exercising power over bodies and futures. Even without kings or formal institutions, the sacred order can sort people into permitted and restricted roles. There is a darker emotional mechanism here too. Fear does not simply enforce through terror of direct punishment. Often it works through anticipatory guilt and communal shame. A person may obey because they do not wish to be the one blamed if things go wrong. This is a potent form of regulation because it internalizes the law before law exists. The body becomes self-monitoring. Desire is checked against taboo. Curiosity is checked against danger. Anger is checked against the need for unity. The social order no longer depends only on external reminders. It begins living inside the individual as conscience-like caution. Civilization will later expand this inward policing through morality, religion, law, and ideology. Its earlier ancestor may be the simple refusal to risk collective harm by acting alone against ancestral practice. This inward turn is one of the most decisive shifts in human history. Predators can be fought, weather endured, injuries tended, but once fear becomes moralized, the human mind starts participating in its own regulation. People carry the group's anxieties inside themselves. They become the guardians of rules even when no one is watching. That is a remarkable form of social technology. It is efficient, portable, and difficult to challenge because it feels like wisdom rather than coercion. Elders know, ancestors know, the place remembers, the ritual matters. Such convictions make daily life more stable, but also less open, and that relative stability changes scale. A community governed by strong shared expectations can remain together more durably. It can return to the same places. It can invest labor in its surroundings. It can structure kinship and inheritance more clearly. It can manage repeated gatherings with less chaos. It can preserve knowledge across generations in more exact form. In short, it becomes more settlement-ready. This does not mean every obedient group becomes sedentary, nor that obedience alone creates villages. Environment, resources, climate, and population all matter enormously. Still, the emotional infrastructure is being prepared. Human beings are learning to live not merely side by side, but under an order that claims authority over everyday conduct. By this point, fear has done something extraordinary. It has moved from lightning and darkness into posture, routine, and conscience. It has become a hidden engineer of social life. People do not only gather to survive immediate threats anymore. They increasingly remain together because the shared order itself feels necessary. The group becomes a protective system whose rules must be obeyed if life is to remain intelligible and safe. This is precisely the kind of psychological and social environment in which more permanent forms of settlement can begin to thrive. And once humans begin settling more permanently, fear does not relax. It intensifies in new ways. Fixed life brings stored food, vulnerable children, exposed crops, territorial attachment, seasonal dependence, and a terrible new anxiety about forces beyond human control reign: drought, fertility, blight, and famine. The sacred order that once stabilized mobile groups will soon be asked to stabilize something even more fragile and demanding. Villages will need the unseen more than wandering bands ever did. The shift into more settled life does not calm the old fears. It rearranges them, amplifies them, and binds them to the future in ways mobile life only partly could. A hunting band can move when a place grows hostile. A village cannot do so easily, especially once labour has been sunk into houses, storage pits, fields, boundaries, pathways, and burial grounds that tie the living to the same patch of land through season after season. The moment people begin depending more heavily on fixed places, fear gains a new object: not just survival today, but continuity tomorrow. A storm no longer threatens only bodies in the open, it threatens roofs, stores, seed, and the promise that effort invested over months will still yield life when the lean season comes. This is why settlements need the sacred with a special intensity. Sedentary existence magnifies vulnerability, and whatever magnifies vulnerability also magnifies the demand for meaning, order, and appeasement. Agriculture, where it begins to emerge, is often described in terms of innovation, surplus, and civilization's eventual triumphs. Those are real enough, but they can obscure the raw anxiety built into farming from the start. To plant is to place trust in a future one cannot control. Seeds disappear into the ground and remain invisible for a time. Rain must come, but not too much. Warmth must arrive, but not too early and not too late. Pests, disease, rot, flood, drought, and cold can undo months of labour without regard for merit or effort. Hunting and gathering certainly involve uncertainty too, often severe uncertainty, but cultivation concentrates that uncertainty into fixed cycles. A failed season can wound an entire community in a way that a failed hunt does not always do. Once food depends on weather and growth over time, human beings become more vulnerable to distant forces they cannot touch: the sky, the soil, and the hidden processes beneath the earth all begin to feel morally and spiritually urgent. This is one reason fertility becomes such a powerful sacred concern in early settled communities. Fertility is not merely reproduction of humans or animals, it is the larger question of whether life continues through the body of the land. The field must yield, herds must multiply, women must survive childbirth, infants must live, stored grain must last. These are all versions of the same plea addressed to a world that can just as easily withhold as provide. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that many early agricultural and proto-agricultural communities place heavy symbolic emphasis on growth, abundance, seasonality, and the forces believed to govern them. Scholars still debate the meanings of figurines, shrines, domestic altars, and seasonal rites in early villages, and no single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern. But the overall pressure is unmistakable. Fixed life requires repeated negotiation with uncertainty, and the sacred offers a language for that negotiation. The emotional structure of a village differs from that of a mobile band in another important way. In a small foraging group, resources may be distributed and consumed relatively quickly. In a settled community, value accumulates visibly. Grain is stored. Tools are kept. Houses are built and rebuilt. The dead may lie under floors or near dwellings. Animals may be enclosed. Paths become habitual. A sense of inside and outside grows stronger, but so does a sense of fragile investment. People now have more to lose in place: theft, fire, blight, social conflict, and environmental disruption threaten not just immediate survival, but the material memory of the group. The sacred becomes crucial, partly because it protects accumulation with invisible authority. A storehouse can be guarded physically, but it can also be surrounded by taboo, blessing, or ritual handling. A boundary can be marked not only with stones, but with ancestral or divine significance. The more value settlement concentrates, the more useful sacred order becomes. There is a lesser-known but revealing point hidden in the archaeology of early settled communities. Domestic space and ritual space are often not fully separate. Hearths, storage areas, figurines, burials, painted walls, and special deposits can coexist within or near ordinary living areas. This suggests that the sacred is not initially confined to isolated temples or public precincts. It saturates daily life. A house is not merely shelter. It may be a site of ancestral presence, fertility concern, household rites, protection, purification, and memory. The threshold is charged, the hearth is charged, the floor beneath which family members are buried is charged. Settled life thickens symbolic life because the same spaces are revisited constantly. Every wall, corner, and platform can accumulate associations. Fear now lives intimately inside architecture. That intimacy matters because settled communities create new forms of interdependence that need moral reinforcement. Fields require timing and cooperation. Irrigation, where it develops, requires coordination. Storage demands restraint and trust. Childcare becomes embedded in denser populations. Conflict becomes harder to escape because neighbours remain neighbours. Kinship systems matter more because inheritance, land use, and household continuity become more consequential. In these conditions, sacred rules do more than manage fear of nature. They manage fear of one another, who may access grain, who belongs to which house, which lineage controls a plot, which union is legitimate, which death requires special response, which impurity must be cleansed before communal life resumes. A village cannot function on improvisation alone. It needs a stable grammar of obligation, and sacred order often supplies it. The seasons make this need relentless. Settlement ties human hope to recurring cycles that are both visible and mysteriously beyond control. The sprouting seed is a miracle so ordinary that later societies can forget how uncanny it must once have felt. A hard object vanishes into soil and months later returns multiplied, edible and life-sustaining. Yet sometimes it does not. Sometimes it rots, fails, dries, or floods away. The earth appears generous and withholding by turns, almost like an intentional power with moods and conditions. One does not need abstract theology to see how the ground itself might become morally charged. Ritual around sowing, harvest, first fruits, rain, and seasonal renewal is an understandable response to a reality in which prosperity depends on hidden processes no one can command directly. The field becomes another sacred threshold, as mysterious in its way as the cave once was. This may also help explain why early villages often show signs of repeated communal acts tied to food, feasting, and seasonal gathering. A feast is never only abundance on display. It can also be a defensive ritual against scarcity, a statement that the group is still in right relation with the powers that govern life. Shared consumption under sacred rules transforms anxiety into solidarity. Everyone sees that stores exist, that obligations are being honoured, that ancestors or unseen forces are being acknowledged, that specialists and elders are guiding the cycle correctly. Even if the feast reduces stores in the short term, it may increase trust, cohesion, and obedience in the long term. No single explanation fully accounts for why communities invest precious resources in ritualized consumption, but fear of instability is surely part of the answer. Settlements also deepen the importance of the dead. In mobile life, the living move on more easily from place to place. In settled life, the dead can remain continuously present within the community's physical world. Burials under house floors, near walls, or within shared spaces mean that ancestry becomes literally foundational. The household may rest above generations of prior lives. This creates a potent fusion of land, memory, and legitimacy. We belong here because our dead are here. We maintain this place because they remain within it. Such arrangements likely intensify both reverence and caution. The ancestors are not distant abstractions. They are close, beneath the living, woven into domestic continuity. The sacred does not float above village life. It inhabits it from below. Another anxiety arrives with settlement that wandering groups can partly avoid demographic density. More people living near one another means more opportunity for disease, dispute, envy, waste accumulation, and social friction. The evidence from later, early villages often includes signs of crowding, changing health patterns, dietary shifts, and episodes of stress. Settled life solves some problems while introducing others. Sacred norms help manage these pressures by structuring behavior in repetitive, emotionally binding ways. Purification, food rules, household boundaries, rites of passage, mourning sequences, and shared ceremonies all help keep dense community from dissolving into constant tension. In this sense, the sacred is not a decorative layer added after settlement succeeds. It may be one of the conditions that make prolonged settlement bearable at all. This is why the sacred order in villages often becomes more regular, more calendrical, and more explicitly tied to cycles of work and survival. A mobile group may perform rites when needed, or when particular places are visited. A settled community increasingly needs rites at predictable times: sowing time, rain time, birth time, harvest time, dry season, flood season, new storage, opening of the storehouse, closing of the year. The future of the village depends on timing, and timing invites ritual structure. This is an important bridge towards civilization because calendars, festivals, and seasonal obligations train communities to coordinate beyond immediate necessity. The sacred becomes a way of organizing collective time. Of course, practical knowledge and sacred explanation continue to coexist. Farmers watch the sky, feel the soil, test seed, remember seasons, and adapt through experience. They are not helpless dreamers waiting for miracles. Yet even the most observant community remains exposed to forces larger than its knowledge. Drought can defeat skill, frost can defeat diligence, locust can defeat planning. That is why the sacred persists. It fills the emotional and social gap between what humans can do and what they cannot guarantee. It reassures, disciplines, and sometimes deceives. But above all, it helps people continue investing effort in a future that may not reward them. Settled life without some stabilizing system of meaning would be an almost unbearable wager. There is a darker implication as well. Once survival depends on predictable cycles, failures become politically and morally dangerous. Someone must be blamed when rains fail, when crops rot, when herds die, when children starve. The sacred order can absorb that blame, but it can also redirect it. Perhaps rites were neglected. Perhaps impurity entered the community. Perhaps the wrong people hold authority. Perhaps an ancestor is offended. Perhaps a boundary was crossed. In this way, the sacred not only steadies villages but becomes entangled with conflict, exclusion, and control. The same system that protects collective hope can also turn misfortune into accusation. Settlements need the sacred, but once they have it, they are never entirely free from its shadow. Still, the larger historical movement is clear. Fixed life intensifies dependence on unseen forces, and therefore intensifies the need to make these forces socially legible. The sacred gives villagers a way to connect weather, fertility, death, labour, lineage, and obedience into one meaningful order. It organises space, time, bodies, and hope. It makes continuity imaginable. That is why settlements need the sacred so badly. Without it, there is food and labour but too little trust, too much uncertainty, and no adequate answer to the terrifying fact that the future of the community lies in powers no one can fully command. And once that sacred order becomes central enough, communities begin doing something even more consequential. They gather not just in houses or household shrines, but in purpose-built spaces that exist primarily to manage their relation to the unseen. At that point, the sacred is no longer merely woven through settlement. It starts standing above it, calling people together on a larger scale than domestic life alone can sustain. There comes a point when the sacred no longer fits entirely inside the household, the grave, the hearth, or the remembered place in the landscape. The obligations have grown too regular, the gatherings too large, the fears too widely shared, and the specialists too socially important for ritual life to remain scattered across the margins of ordinary existence. People begin creating spaces whose primary purpose is not sleeping, storing, cooking, or hiding from weather, but meeting the unseen together. This is one of the great thresholds in human history. It suggests that the need to negotiate fear, death, fertility, weather, ancestry, and cosmic uncertainty has become strong enough to organize labor beyond immediate material necessity. In that sense, temples may stand among the earliest truly collective buildings, not because humans suddenly become prosperous and symbolic afterward, but because the symbolic need itself helps produce new forms of coordination before urban civilization is fully established. Few sites capture this possibility more powerfully than places where monumental or clearly special architecture appears before large permanent cities in the later historical sense. The most famous example is often discussed in terms almost too dramatic for its own good, but the underlying question is real and important. Why would mobile or semi-settled communities gather in significant numbers to build ritual structures before they had developed the dense bureaucratic life of mature urban societies? Scholars still debate the answer intensely. Some emphasize feasting networks, some ecological concentration of resources, some seasonal congregation, some emerging hierarchy, some symbolic competition, some changing relations between humans and animals, and some the social force of ritual itself. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, yet one possibility remains especially compelling in the context of this long human story. Sacred spaces capable of managing shared fear and uncertainty may have helped assemble people before administration, not merely after it. This reverses a familiar assumption. It is common to imagine that first humans settle, then produce surplus, then invent religion in grander form to decorate or justify the new order. But archaeology complicates that neat sequence. In some places, large communal structures with strong ritual signatures appear surprisingly early, suggesting that sacred activity may not simply be a product of settled civilization. It may be one of the engines that draws humans toward more complex forms of settled life. If dispersed groups return again and again to a significant site, they must coordinate movement, timing, labor, exchange, and memory. They must maintain relationships across households and seasons. They must agree, however imperfectly, on common acts and common meanings. The sacred site becomes a magnet around which society thickens. This should not be read as mystical overstatement. Ritual centers do not float above material life. They require food, effort, tools, and people whose time is partially freed for building and performance. But that is precisely the point. If communities are willing to invest scarce resources in creating and maintaining places that serve primarily symbolic and ceremonial purposes, then symbolic life is already doing heavy practical work. It is binding groups together, stabilizing expectation, and making cooperation worthwhile at scales beyond kin alone. Fear plays a central part here because the sacred center promises something ordinary space cannot promise. It offers a place where the most uncontrollable features of existence can be approached in organized form. Weather, fertility, death, and fate may remain unconquered, but they no longer feel entirely unmanaged. There is a lesser-known but striking aspect of early monumental ritual spaces. Many seem designed less for comfort than for impact. Massive pillars, carved animal forms, raised enclosures, controlled entry, repeated symbolism, and visual emphasis all suggest environments meant to impress the body and direct attention. Such spaces do not simply host gatherings, they shape emotion. A person entering them feels smaller, more focused, more aware of collective presence, and more aware that this place belongs to powers beyond ordinary domestic life. That emotional choreography matters. Civilization depends not only on feeding people and storing goods, but on persuading them that shared orders are real. Monumental sacred space makes invisible order visible through scale. Animal imagery in such settings is also revealing. Predators, dangerous creatures and scavengers, serpents, boars, birds of prey, and other charged animals appear with unusual force in early symbolic environments. This may reflect hunting identity, cosmological systems, clan signs, or mythic narratives, and scholars continue to debate the balance among these possibilities. Yet fear is never far away. Many of the animals emphasized in early sacred contexts are precisely those that threaten, unsettle, or blur the line between human control and wild force. To carve, arrange, or display them in ritual settings may be a way of mastering them symbolically without eliminating their danger materially. The sacred center becomes a controlled encounter with the forces that shaped human dread from the beginning. Another important possibility is that ritual centers help solve the problem of trust between groups. Small communities can maintain cohesion through face-to-face familiarity, kinship, and repeated practical cooperation. Larger networks require more. They need shared ceremonies, shared calendars, shared obligations, and shared experiences intense enough to overcome suspicion. A communal sacred site provides exactly that. People arrive from different places, participate in coordinated acts, eat together, witness the same symbols, submit to the same restrictions, and leave with renewed awareness that they belong to something larger than their immediate household. This is not yet the impersonal citizenship of a city, but it is a step towards supra-local identity. The sacred center creates social scale. Feasting likely becomes especially important here. A major ritual gathering often involves food in quantities that exceed ordinary domestic consumption. Feasts are practical in one sense. but they are also political, emotional, and cosmological. They demonstrate abundance, generosity, alliance, and proper relation to the unseen. To consume together in a sacred context reassures participants that uncertainty is still being held at bay through coordinated action. It also creates obligation. Those who host, organize, or preside over such events gain prestige. Those who contribute labor or goods gain standing within the wider network. The result is not simply ritual for its own sake. It is ritual becoming a mechanism for assembling, ranking, and integrating communities. This is where architecture begins to cross into power more visibly. A special building or enclosure must be planned, built, maintained, and controlled. Someone decides where it stands. Someone knows how one enters. Someone interprets its symbols. Someone oversees rites. Someone likely regulates who may approach which zones and in what condition. The sacred building therefore does more than gather people. It concentrates authority. Earlier ritual specialists may have worked within camps, caves, and burial grounds. Now their successors, or the emerging figures that resemble them, stand within structures that materialize their importance. Sacred expertise no longer moves only with the person. It is fixed in place, amplified by walls, stones, alignments, and repeated public performance. There is still uncertainty about whether one should call every early ritual structure a temple in the later sense. The word can mislead if it imports assumptions about priesthood, doctrine, or institutional religion too early. But the broader idea remains useful. Humans are creating purpose-built sacred centers, and that creation has civilizational consequences. A built sacred center can outlast the people who first established it. It can store memory, it can attract future labor, it can accumulate offerings, traditions, and rules. It can train bodies in how to gather, wait, approach, abstain, and obey. In short, it can become an institution before writing. This may be one reason why some of the earliest large communal structures seem to precede the full rise of city administration. Institutions of sacred order can stabilize recurring gatherings even without formal bureaucracy. They generate schedules, roles, and norms. They encourage predictability. They may even encourage nearby settlement because repeated return to a site becomes easier if some people remain close to maintain it, guard it, provision it, or cultivate nearby resources. In this way, the temple-like center may not simply crown settled life. It may help anchor it. People gather for ritual. Ritual requires continuity. Continuity encourages settlement. Settlement supports more ritual. The cycle tightens. Of course, material pressures remain decisive too. Climate shifts, rich local ecologies, demographic clustering, and technological developments all shape where and when complex settlements emerge. It would be simplistic to claim that fear alone builds temples, or that temples alone create civilization. But fear, ritual, and sacred architecture may form a chain of causation strong enough to deserve a central place in the story. Human beings, faced for millennia with death, weather, darkness, invisible causes, and the burden of future dependence, create increasingly elaborate ways to gather around the unknown. The built sacred center is one of the most consequential results of that effort. There is a darker side already visible here. Once sacred space becomes monumental, the difference between participant and controller sharpens. Not everyone builds equally, not everyone interprets equally, not everyone commands access equally. What began as a communal response to uncertainty can become a stage on which certain lineages, specialists, or factions display superiority. The authority of those who speak for the unseen grows harder to challenge when it is backed by enduring architecture. A cave belongs to the land. A temple-like structure belongs, more clearly, to whoever organizes its use. Sacred fear has now become attachable to offices, spaces, and public hierarchies in ways that portable ritual never allowed so fully. And yet the attraction remains understandable. In a world still vulnerable to crop failure, storm, disease, death, and social fracture, a built center of sacred order promises continuity stronger than memory alone. It says that the group will return, that the rites will continue, that the dead and the powers beyond sight have not been forgotten, that the future can still be faced together. That promise is one of the emotional foundations on which later civilization will stand. Before cities fully rise, humans are already learning to build not only shelters for the body, but houses for fear itself. So the temple comes, in embryonic or unmistakable form, before cities have completely become themselves. It arrives because the sacred has grown too central to remain diffuse, and because large groups need focal points stronger than household custom to hold them together. The first monumental sacred spaces are therefore not side notes to civilization. They are evidence that human beings may have assembled around dread, memory, fertility, ancestors, an invisible order before they assembled around offices, taxation, and written law. The city will come, but the sacred enclosure may have taught people first how to gather for something bigger than survival alone. By the time sacred spaces stand above ordinary dwellings and gather people from beyond the household, the old question returns in a sharper form: what, exactly, brought civilization into being? Was it hunger and surplus, the hard arithmetic of grain and storage? Was it cooperation under ecological pressure? Was it the ability to dominate landscapes, breed plants, manage herds, and remain in place long enough for hierarchy to harden? Or was something less tangible but no less powerful already doing the deeper work? Long before writing and kings made its influence obvious, scholars have argued over these questions for generations, and they should. The origins of civilization are too complex for a single cause. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation from vulnerable, prehistoric bands to settled societies capable of building ritual centers, governing behavior, and eventually producing cities. But once fear has been followed through all its stages, from the storm in the dark to the sacred enclosure, it becomes harder to treat it as a mere side effect. One common explanation begins with surplus. In this view, the decisive threshold is material. Once people can produce more food than they immediately consume, they can support specialists, build structures, maintain leaders, and invest labor in institutions not directly tied to daily subsistence. Surplus makes hierarchy possible, and hierarchy makes civilization visible. There is a great deal of truth in this. Stored grain changes time. It allows planning, taxation later on, differential control of resources, and the support of people whose work is ritual, administrative, or coercive rather than agricultural. Without some degree of reliable surplus, large-scale social complexity is difficult to sustain. Yet surplus alone does not explain why humans would choose to gather in dense, risky, labor-intensive ways, nor why some of their earliest major collective efforts seem directed toward ritual and symbolic centers rather than purely economic infrastructure. Another explanation emphasizes environment, river valleys, rich ecotones, seasonal abundance zones, and regions of climatic opportunity may simply make settlement and population growth more likely. Once enough people occupy a productive landscape, complexity follows almost naturally. Pressure breeds innovation. Competition breeds coordination. That account also holds real force. Geography matters. Climate matters. The availability of domesticable plants and animals matters profoundly. But again, environmental opportunity does not organize itself. A rich valley does not automatically create trust, obligation, symbolic legitimacy, or durable social roles. People still need reasons to bind themselves to one another and to the place, especially when doing so increases exposure to disease, conflict, crop failure, and inequality. A third line of thought places cooperation at the center. Humans are unusually good at collaborating in flexible, large-scale ways. Shared labor, teaching, imitation, punishment of defectors, child-rearing networks, and cumulative cultural learning all contribute to our success. Civilization, in this account, is the flowering of cooperative intelligence. This too is essential. But cooperation does not float free of emotion. It needs a binding force stronger than convenience in moments when individual interest diverges from collective necessity. Why submit to ritual burdens, food restrictions, seasonal obligations, or labor for buildings one may not personally enjoy? Why accept taboos, specialists, or ancestral claims over the land? Why continue investing in a village after repeated losses? Cooperation explains the capacity to act together, but it does not always explain why people remain committed to the shared order when fear, grief, and uncertainty make solitary or short-term choices tempting. This is where religion, or at least sacred order in a broad prehistoric sense, enters many arguments. Some scholars have proposed that shared belief, ritual, and symbolic systems make large-scale cooperation possible by giving groups common meaning, moral rules, and invisible enforcement. A person may steal grain when no one sees, but perhaps not if ancestors, spirits, or gods are believed to see. A family may resist communal labor, but perhaps not if the sacred calendar makes participation obligatory. A settlement may fracture under scarcity, but perhaps less readily if ritual feasting, burial continuity, and sacred architecture reinforce belonging. This line of reasoning has grown increasingly influential in different forms, especially where evidence suggests that symbolic and ceremonial life is not merely a late expression of complex society, but one of the forces helping to generate it. Yet even this must be treated carefully. To say religion helps create civilization is not the same as saying humans simply invent comforting myths, and then everything else follows. Belief systems are not detachable software placed atop an otherwise rational material process. They emerge from embodied lives already saturated with danger, memory, death, and social dependence. That is why fear matters so much in the debate. Fear may not be the sole cause, but it is one of the most plausible emotional engines connecting material conditions to sacred systems and sacred systems to durable social order. Fear of nature, fear of death, fear of disorder, fear of the unseen, fear of famine, fear of social rupture, all create pressure for explanations, rituals, as specialists, boundaries, obedience, and gathering places. Civilization may therefore be less the victory over fear than the long institutionalization of it. There is a lesser known but important distinction to make here between acute fear and chronic fear. Acute fear is the immediate response to threat. Chronic fear is the long-term awareness that life remains vulnerable even in times of apparent calm. Civilizations are not built in the instant of panic. They are built in the extended effort to prevent panic from returning unchecked. A harvest festival makes sense because famine remains imaginable. Burial ritual matters because death remains near. Sacred law matters because betrayal, impurity, or chaos remain possible. Monumental structures matter because memory needs reinforcement stronger than speech alone. In this sense, fear is not merely a starting spark. It becomes a continuing condition that institutions attempt to manage across generations. The evidence for all this is necessarily indirect, but the pattern is striking. Again and again in human history, the systems that bind large groups are tied to invisible consequences. Moral rules are backed by unseen watchers. Social roles are sanctified. Calendars align with sacred time. Boundaries are made holy. Leaders claim favor, ancestry, or mandate beyond ordinary proof. This does not mean cynicism lies at the root of everything. Many participants sincerely believe. Many rituals genuinely comfort and coordinate. Still, the structure reveals something deep. Humans often cooperate most powerfully when danger has been woven into meaning, and meaning into obligation. Fear, in other words, becomes socially productive when translated into a sacred frame. Of course, there are competing objections. Some would argue that fear is too negative, too narrow, too reductionist a foundation for civilization. Humans also build from wonder, love, curiosity, pride, beauty, and play. Ritual can celebrate as much as it appeases. Monuments can arise from joy, identity, and the desire to belong to something enduring, not merely from dread. This objection is valid and necessary. A civilization explained only through fear would be a distorted one. The human story is broader and richer than that, but broadness should not erase origins. Wonder often grows at the edge of fear. Beauty often stabilizes what fear first compels. Love itself becomes more organized under conditions where danger makes care necessary. Civilization may well become more than fear, but it does not follow that fear was unimportant in its making. Another objection emphasizes domination rather than anxiety. Perhaps civilization begins not because humans are afraid, but because ambitious individuals or groups discover how to concentrate labor and extract obedience. In this account, sacred systems are tools for power more than sincere responses to uncertainty. There is some truth here too, especially later. Elites repeatedly learn to use the sacred for control, but the earliest phases are less easily reduced to manipulation from above, because the emotional need appears too widespread and too old. Before there are clear elites in the later sense, there are already burials, taboos, sacred places, ritual specialists, and communal structures oriented toward invisible order. This suggests that sacred life is not initially invented by rulers. It becomes available to rulers later because it was already socially central. Perhaps the best way to frame the debate is this: environment provides pressures and opportunities. Subsistence strategies provide material foundations. Cooperation provides capacity, but fear may provide urgency. Fear tells human beings that they cannot leave the future unstructured. It tells them that randomness is intolerable, death unforgettable, and unseen danger too costly to ignore. In response, they produce rituals, sacred centers, ancestral landscapes, moral rules, and specialists. Those forms then make larger settlements, more complex obligations, and enduring institutions more possible. Civilization is therefore not caused by fear alone, but fear may be one of the forces that make the rest cohere. This interpretation also helps explain why the earliest large human systems so often blur religion, law, kinship, agriculture, and authority rather than separating them. If all these institutions emerge partly from a shared effort to manage vulnerability, then it makes sense that they are entangled at first. The same sacred order governs rain, sexuality, burial, land, purity, hierarchy, and memory, because all are exposed points where disorder can enter. Only much later do societies develop the illusion that these are separate domains. In the beginning, they are one fabric because the fears that animate them are one fabric too. What survives in the archaeological and anthropological record does not let us declare a final answer. Scholars still debate the sequence, weight, and universality of each factor, and they should continue to do so. Civilizations arise in different ecologies and by different paths. Some are more centralized, some more ritual-heavy, some more trade-oriented, some more militarized, some more agriculturally driven. Yet across that variation, one recurring truth remains visible. Human beings repeatedly turn uncertainty into system. They build meaning around danger. They transform dread into institutions. Whether one names that religion, symbolic culture, sacred order, or the politics of the unseen, it belongs near the center of the story. And if it belongs near the center, then the first fear was never just a primitive weakness left behind by progress. It was one of the original builders. It urged people to remember, gather, obey, perform, bury, mark, store, and build. It drove them toward explanations that were often incomplete, sometimes mistaken, but socially potent. It may not explain everything, but without it the rise of civilization becomes strangely bloodless, as though humans calmly reason their way into complexity from a position of security. The record suggests something more human than that. Civilization rises from exposed lives trying to keep the world from becoming unrecognizable again. The debate, then, is not really between material causes and emotional causes, or between environment and belief, or between surplus and fear. It is about how these forces braid together. Grain matters, rain matters, rivers matter, cooperation matters. But so does the trembling memory of storm, famine, death, darkness, and loss. So does the need to believe that these things can be faced under a shared order. That may be the true threshold civilization crosses, not when humans stop being afraid, but when they learn to turn fear into structures strong enough to outlast the people who first built them. Once fear has helped build shared rules, sacred places, ritual specialists, and the first durable centers of collective life, it begins producing a harder consequence. The same force that once protected vulnerable groups from chaos can also justify new forms of human power. This is the cost of fear-based order, a community that believes danger comes not only from storms, predators, famine, and death, but also from impurity, disobedience, neglected ritual, offended ancestors, or unseen judgment, becomes easier to discipline from within. The old emotional bargain remains the same: submit to the order, and the world may remain survivable. But now that bargain can be expanded beyond necessity. What began as caution slowly becomes hierarchy. What began as shared ritual becomes controlled access. What began as protection becomes permission for some people to decide how others must live. This does not happen all at once, and it does not happen in exactly the same way everywhere. Some communities remain relatively egalitarian for long periods, even while maintaining rich sacred systems. Others seem to move more quickly toward concentrated power, unequal status, and restricted knowledge. The evidence remains incomplete, especially in the earliest periods, and scholars still debate how sharply hierarchy grows in different prehistoric settings. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the rise of strong authority unless the emotional leverage of fear is taken seriously. People obey not only because they are forced, but because the alternative feels dangerous in ways that are cosmic, ancestral, social, and deeply personal. That kind of obedience can be extended much further than simple practical necessity requires. One of the clearest examples lies in control over sacred knowledge. At first, ritual may be widely shared, even if specialists guide it. Over time, however, certain acts, places, symbols, or interpretations can become restricted. Not everyone enters the deepest cave. Not everyone approaches the burial ground in the same way. Not everyone hears the full story, learns the full sequence, or handles the most charged objects. This restriction may begin as caution. Some things are too dangerous, too potent, or too important for casual use. But restriction also creates rank. Those who know more, enter further, or speak with greater authority are elevated above those who do not. Sacred mystery becomes a resource. The more fear surrounds it, the more valuable control over it becomes. That control can extend into the body itself. Once communities tie safety and legitimacy to correct behavior, bodies become sites of regulation. Who may touch whom? Who may marry? Who may eat first? Who may enter while bleeding, mourning, sick, pregnant, or newly initiated? Who may approach sacred space after death has entered their household? Who must abstain? Who must be purified? These rules may preserve order, identity, and health in some contexts, but they also sort people into statuses that can harden over time. A person is no longer only a member of the group, they are a body placed within a graded system of permission and restriction. Fear gives this sorting moral force. To resist the rule is not merely to challenge a custom, it is to risk disorder itself. Sacrifice, in one form or another, belongs to this darker development because it reveals the full severity of fear organized into sacred logic. Sacrifice need not begin with spectacular violence. It may start as offerings of food, goods, time, labor, or abstinence. Something of value is relinquished so that danger may be lessened or favor secured. That principle is understandable and very old. But once the sacred order teaches that loss can purchase protection, the scale of acceptable loss may expand. Animal life may be offered, wealth may be consumed publicly, bodies may be marked, deprived, secluded, or submitted to ordeal. In later civilizations, and perhaps in some earlier ones, even human beings can be drawn into sacrificial logic. Scholars debate how early such extremes appear and under what conditions. But the structural possibility is present from the moment fear and exchange merge. If the world is dangerous enough, almost any price can be framed as necessary. There is a lesser known but important psychological mechanism here. Fear makes costly actions feel persuasive. The more difficult, painful, or expensive a rite is, the more participants may feel that it must matter. A trivial act seems too weak for great danger. A demanding act appears proportionate to the threat. This helps explain why elaborate, burdensome, or even brutal rituals can endure. Their cost becomes part of their credibility. If the harvest, the dead, the ancestors, the sky, and the future of the community all hang in the balance, then easy gestures do not feel sufficient. The sacred order deepens itself through gravity. Severity becomes proof of seriousness. And seriousness, in fearful societies, is often a form of authority. Exclusion follows naturally. Every shared order defines insiders and outsiders, but fear-based orders sharpen that boundary because outsiders are not merely different. They may be impure, dangerous, unknown to the ancestors, ignorant of the rites, or threatening to the invisible balance on which the community believes survival depends. Foreigners, deviants, those who break taboo, those born outside the approved kinship lines, those associated with bodily or social irregularity, can all become charged figures. The group protects itself by narrowing belonging. This may strengthen cohesion in dangerous conditions, but it also produces cruelty, suspicion, and inherited inequality. Civilization does not invent exclusion from nothing. It inherits it from earlier systems that learn to treat boundary maintenance as protection against chaos. At the same time, fear-based order can justify obedience to leadership even when leadership no longer serves primarily protective ends. A ritual specialist who once guided burial and storm rites may now influence land access, marriage recognition, seasonal labor, or communal punishment. A lineage claiming special favor with ancestors or sacred powers may secure precedence in ways that outlast any original practical merit. A guardian of the shrine or sacred enclosure may become a gatekeeper of resources, alliances, and legitimacy. The sacred office thickens into political office. That does not mean it was fraudulent from the start. More often, genuine communal need gradually creates structures that can later be used for unequal benefit. Power arrives through necessity and then lingers beyond it. One sees this darkening especially in the relationship between memory and command. Ancestors, once sources of continuity and comfort, can become tools of discipline. The dead are said to approve some unions and condemn others. The founders are invoked to justify claims over land. Old disasters are remembered selectively to reinforce current rules. The past becomes sacred not only because it is revered, but because it authorizes. Fear of repeating catastrophe makes communities vulnerable to those who claim special access to ancestral memory. Do this, or the old ruin returns. Obey this line, or the land withholds. Maintain this rank, or disorder reopens. In this way, historical suffering itself can be converted into social control. Gender may also become more sharply structured under these conditions. The archaeological record cannot always reveal ideology directly, and broad claims must be made cautiously. But many later early civilizations show strong links between sacred order, fertility control, inheritance, and differentiated roles for men and women. Some of these roles may have practical roots in labor, reproduction, and kinship patterns. Others likely draw force from fear around blood, birth, sexuality, descent, and household continuity. When a society believes its future depends on properly managed fertility and legitimate lineage, the regulation of women's bodies, marriages, and reproductive roles often intensifies. Men too may be subjected to initiation, warfare obligations, and ritual burden. But the general pattern remains significant fear about continuity can become hierarchy inscribed onto sex and gender. Children, meanwhile, are born into orders whose original necessity they may never fully see. What began generations earlier as a response to real danger now appears simply as the way things are. This is how fear becomes civilization's inheritance. A child grows up learning who can speak, who must listen, which places are forbidden, which acts pollute, whose body carries greater authority, and what disaster follows disobedience. The emotional source may be ancient and partly forgotten, but its structure remains. Fear no longer needs to be freshly experienced in every generation to shape behavior. It has already been built into custom, architecture, rank, and moral instinct. In this sense, the cost of fear-based order is not only oppression in obvious moments, It is the normalization of unequal arrangements that feel natural because they are old. Yet it would be too simple to treat all of this as mere corruption. Fear-based order continues to do real work. It still binds communities. It still gives people meaning, mutual obligation, and ways to confront death and uncertainty. Even severe rites may genuinely comfort those who perform them. Even hierarchy may sometimes stabilize cooperation in fragile conditions. This is the uncomfortable truth. The same systems that protect can dominate, and often the boundary between protection and domination is hard to draw from within. People may sincerely experience sacred authority as both burdensome and necessary. That ambiguity is one reason such systems endure so long. Still, the consequences accumulate. Once sacred fear legitimizes exclusion, sacrifice, and hierarchy, civilization begins carrying a double inheritance. It gains coordination, continuity, and symbolic depth. But it also gains methods for making inequality feel inevitable and suffering feel justified. Those who die in sacrifice may be said to preserve the whole. Those denied access may be said to threaten purity. Those subordinated may be told that the ancestors, the gods, or the cosmic order require it. In that sense, fear no longer merely responds to danger. It starts reproducing danger inside society itself, turning human beings into one another's managed risk. This is a crucial turning point because it shows that civilization is not simply the triumph of order over chaos. It is also the triumph of certain forms of order over other possible ways of living. Fear helps communities survive, but it also narrows the range of futures they can imagine. Once sacred structures become authoritative enough, alternatives feel not just difficult, but forbidden. A different marriage pattern, a different burial, a different relation to land, a different distribution of status, may appear not merely unusual but catastrophic. Power prefers this emotional climate. It thrives where dissent can be described as danger. So the cost of fear-based order is not an accidental side effect. It is built into the mechanism itself. The more a community depends on sacred order to contain uncertainty, the more tempting it becomes to expand that order into every corner of life. What began as a shield against the unknown becomes a framework through which some people govern the known. Civilization rises higher, but its foundations grow heavier, beneath temples, laws, calendars, and lineages lies an older impulse still doing its work, the belief that survival depends on submission to forms strong enough to hold back chaos, whatever else those forms may demand in return. That is why the final question remains so important. If fear helped build the earliest civilizations and also helped justify their harshest inequalities, then it has never really left the human world. It may change names, symbols, and institutions, but the underlying pattern persists. The first fear is still with us, not only in what we dread, but in the kinds of systems we continue building to make dread feel governable. The oldest fear never disappears. It changes clothing, changes language, changes architecture, changes the scale at which it operates, but it does not leave the human story behind. The child once pulled close at the mouth of a cave becomes, after thousands of years, a citizen inside walls, a farmer under a temple calendar, a subject kneeling before divine kingship, a worshipper beneath stone ceilings, a worker inside a city that promises order because the world beyond order still feels capable of collapse. Civilization often presents itself as the answer to fear, and in one sense it is. It gives food storage, law, ritual continuity, social roles, fortified settlements, an explanation strong enough to make suffering feel less random. But underneath those achievements lies a harder truth. Civilization is also fear made durable. It is anxiety translated into institutions so solid that later generations forget the trembling lives from which they first arose. One way to see this is to notice how often the great structures of organized life still revolve around controlling uncertainty. The earlier shrines, burial grounds, ritual enclosures, and sacred centers try to manage death, weather, fertility, and invisible danger. Later civilizations formalize the same effort with astonishing confidence. They name gods of storm, flood, plague, harvest, and war. They build calendars to stabilize time. They elevate priests, kings, judges, and scribes who can speak on behalf of order. They define purity and pollution. They mark lawful and unlawful bodies, lawful and unlawful unions, lawful and unlawful speech. They promise that if the right rites are performed, the right taxes paid, the right offerings made, the right commands obeyed, the world will remain intelligible. That promise is civilization's great seduction. It says chaos can be kept outside if the structure is maintained. Yet the structure never truly abolishes what it fears. Cities burn, rivers change course, empires starve, earthquakes ignore rank, disease passes through walls and sanctuaries alike, dynasties fail, harvests collapse, the dead remain dead. This is why civilizations so often become repetitive in their sacred language. They must keep renewing order because order never becomes final. The old prehistoric problem remains inside the polished forms of the historical world. Human beings still need explanations that connect danger to meaning. They still need rituals that turn helplessness into action. They still need places where the unknown can be approached under rules. They still need authorities who claim to know what invisible forces require. The tools become more elaborate, but the emotional engine is recognizably ancient. There is a lesser-known way this inheritance survives even outside formal religion. Institutions that seem wholly practical often carry the same deep logic. A boundary marked on land says the inside is safer than the outside. A legal code says behavior can keep disaster at bay if properly regulated. A state archive, a census, a granary, a clock, a calendar, a watchtower, a gate. All are material attempts to make uncertainty measurable and therefore governable. They do not look like the first cave rites or burial offerings, yet they answer the same pressure. Human beings remain uncomfortable with a world that can shift without permission. We build systems that promise continuity precisely because continuity is fragile. The first fear survives not only in sanctuaries, but in administration. Architecture reveals this clearly. Even now, the most powerful buildings in human societies are often those that present themselves as barriers against chaos. Temples, courts, palaces, fortresses, capitals, banks, archives, museums, and memorials all express a familiar claim in different forms. What matters can be contained, guarded, remembered, and made stable here. Thick walls, elevated platforms, formal entrances, controlled access, restricted knowledge, ceremonial movement, and symbolic decoration all continue the ancient separation between safe interior and dangerous exterior. The old firelight circle has expanded, but it has not vanished. Civilization still builds lit interiors against an unpredictable dark. The same inheritance appears in moral life. Prehistoric fear once taught communities to regulate food, sex, burial, territory, and obedience, because the price of error felt collective and catastrophic. Modern societies, however secular they imagine themselves, often preserve similar instincts. Bodies remain regulated. Boundaries remain sacred. Certain violations feel larger than the practical harm they cause because they are experienced as threats to the order that keeps life coherent. Shame, guilt, taboo, scandal, and public ritual all show that human beings still turn anxiety into moral structure. Scholars still debate how much of morality emerged from reciprocity and how much from mechanisms of social control, and no single explanation fully accounts for the whole field. But the old pattern endures. Fear still wants conduct to be supervised by meanings bigger than the individual. Memory may be the most enduring vessel of all. Civilizations preserve stories of flood, fire, plague, exile, collapse, divine anger, cursed places, and ancestral suffering with remarkable persistence. These stories are not only historical recollections, they are emotional tools. They warn, they unify, they justify institutions. They tell each generation that the present order exists for a reason, often because an earlier world failed, suffered, or nearly vanished. This is very old. Long before written chronicles, human groups were already carrying forward remembered danger as a guide for future conduct. In that sense, every civilization is partly an archive of fear, storing old catastrophes so they can continue shaping the living. And still, fear is never only destructive. This is the part of the story that matters just as much as the darker one. Fear made humans gather more tightly, care for the injured, remember the dead, tend the fire, teach the young, and imagine consequences beyond the moment. It may have helped create ritual, but it also helped create solidarity. It may have justified hierarchy, but it also helped generate cooperation at scales otherwise impossible. It may have narrowed life through taboo and exclusion, but it also deepened it through symbolism, memory, and the refusal to treat existence as meaningless accident. Civilization inherits all of this at once. The first fear is both burden and builder. That is why it still lingers in the emotional foundations of modern life even when its original shape is forgotten. People still search for signs during crisis. They still gather at special places when death becomes overwhelming. They still want leaders who sound certain when uncertainty spreads. They still perform rituals after disaster, whether religious, civic, or personal. They still divide the world into zones of order and zones of danger. They still preserve the names of the dead in stone, keep calendars of remembrance, build institutions to outlast individual lives, and tell stories that make catastrophe seem survivable because it can be placed inside a larger pattern. The technologies have changed beyond recognition. The nervous system beneath them has changed very little. So the ancient fear is still with us, but not only as panic. It survives as infrastructure of thought. It lives in the instinct to make disorder meaningful, to convert danger into system, to trust the boundary, the ritual, the archive, the law, the sacred calendar, the guarded building, the authoritative voice. It lives in the way human beings cannot quite endure a purely random world. We keep building against randomness, materially and symbolically, because somewhere very deep in the species' memory there remains the sense of standing under a sky that can become violent without warning. And perhaps that is the final irony. The first fear that helped create civilization was not just fear of death, or storm, or darkness. It was fear of helplessness before an indifferent world. Civilization rises from the long answer humans give to that helplessness. It says we will remember, gather, build, mark, bury, obey, interpret, and return. We will create places where chaos is named, spaces where danger is negotiated, systems that promise continuity. We will make the world feel inhabited by order even when the order is fragile. That promise can become oppressive, and history is full of the damage it has done. But it also explains why human beings kept going, kept building, and kept refusing to let terror be the final shape of reality. So the story closes where it began, with a frightened human body in a dangerous landscape. Only now the landscape is crowded with everything that fear eventually built: hearths, graves, shrines, walls, fields, calendars, laws, sacred centres, lineages, cities, monuments, and memories dense enough to make the world feel almost human in return. Behind all of them, still, is that first hard lesson learned in the dark: survival is not enough unless fear can be given form. Civilization is one of the forms we gave it. The night does not end all at once. It softens by degrees, the way memory softens, leaving shapes behind even after the terror that first gave them meaning has passed. Somewhere in the far distance of human time, the first people to hold one another close beneath thunder, beneath cold stars, beneath the sound of things moving just outside the reach of fire, could not have imagined what would one day rise from that fear. They could not have imagined the temple stair, the city wall, the granary door sealed for winter, the law cut into stone, the king speaking in the voice of heaven, the quiet room where records are kept against forgetting, the cemetery laid out in lines, the household threshold blessed against sorrow, the monument lifted for those who are gone but not permitted to vanish. And yet all of it is there, folded faintly inside the older gesture of drawing a boundary against the dark. Civilization likes to tell stories about its own confidence. It prefers origins made of brilliance, invention, triumph, and ascent. It likes to picture human beings stepping forward into order because they were ready, because they were clever enough, because history was always leaning upward. But the older picture is quieter and more fragile. People were afraid. They were afraid of sky and winter, of hunger and sudden illness, of the dead who stayed vivid in memory, of the child who might not survive the season, of the field that might fail, of the strange silence before catastrophe, of the possibility that suffering had no pattern and no answer. They built because they could not bear to leave that fear unanswered forever. They made systems because the open world was too uncertain. They gathered because no one nervous system could hold the burden alone. They turned dread into ritual, ritual into custom, custom into authority, authority into stone, and stone into the long illusion that perhaps order might last. It never lasts in the absolute sense. That may be the most human part of the whole story. Every wall is eventually weathered. Every sacred centre becomes old ground. Every certainty is inherited by people who no longer remember the original terror clearly enough to understand why it felt necessary. Cities fall. Rivers move. Fields dry. Languages disappear. Gods are renamed. Yet something persists beneath those changes. The impulse remains. Human beings continue to make places where grief can stand upright, where fear can be spoken in a controlled voice, where the dead can be placed carefully, where time can be measured, where danger can be held at least briefly inside a form. We're still doing what they did, even now. We're still trying to build interiors against the dark. And perhaps that is why the story lingers, not because the first fear has been conquered, but because it never fully could be. It became architecture. It became memory. It became the habit of making meaning when the world feels larger than the mind can safely hold. In the beginning there is only night, weather, breath, and the uneasy closeness of others waiting for morning. Then comes the fire, the warning, the grave, the right, the threshold, the sacred place, the wall. The world changes shape around those things until one day it looks like civilization. But far underneath, almost too far down to hear, there is still the old sound of thunder across an open land, and a small human group listening, together, trying to decide what kind of world they're living in, and what they must build so they can bear to remain inside it.